I became a doctor to protect lives. But is it enough?
We called you here because this kingdom needs a miracle. You are that miracle. Doctor.
A veterinarian, a doctor who treats animals. It was a profession most people had heard of through stories, novels, or movies, but few truly understood the weight of it. For Kazami Shingo, though, it was his entire life. He stepped into the lab that morning like any other day, ready for work. But nothing about that day would stay ordinary. Somewhere far beyond his world, a group of 5 figures stood together in a vast, sweeping landscape. Among them was a man carrying a stethoscope, his veterinary background clear at a glance. The others were far less ordinary. Some had animal ears, others wore strange clothing, and one girl stood out in a crisp military uniform. It was a world unlike anything Kazami had ever known. Back in the real world, Kazami sat at his desk in the university pathology office. He muttered about the frustrating pace of test results and the constant pressure that came with the work. A senior colleague told him not to let it get to him, reminding him that none of it was his fault. Kazami assured him he was fine, that he could handle it. But in his mind, he knew the truth. Diagnosing animals was never simple. Every case was unpredictable, and the welfare of living creatures always hung in the balance. He prepared to head out on a farm visit, telling himself to stay cautious and make careful decisions. It was just who he was. Careful, methodical, maybe overly so. Meanwhile, in a world far removed from Kazami's own, a young man named Eurus Rawl Maguire approached a secluded pavilion within the Austria Kingdom's imperial capital garden, the Amber Palace. Inside, Emperor Caesar Rawl Maguire was waiting. The emperor addressed Eurus directly, acknowledging his dual role as both the first prince and the prime minister. There was an edge to the conversation, an unspoken tension surrounding some confidential arrangement involving a priest. The emperor brought up an old legend. Throughout the continent's history, certain individuals, known as Marabito, had appeared from other worlds and changed the course of entire nations. These unique people had brought knowledge and power that reshaped civilizations. The emperor admitted their influence was undeniable and hinted that in times of crisis, such a person could be an invaluable asset. Eurus explained that preparations were already underway. A summoning ritual had been set in motion to bring one of these unique individuals to their country. He believed that the right person, with the right skills, could help smaller nations grow stronger and maintain the fragile peace that held the continent together. But the conversation took a sharper turn. Eurus warned that if a rival power got their hands on a Marabito first, the balance of the entire continent could collapse. Every kingdom was desperate, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Then, with quiet confidence, Eurus revealed what made their summoned guest so special. He is a doctor, Eurus said, one who specializes in beasts. It was a strategic advantage no one else had considered, and it changed everything. Kazami opened the trunk of his vehicle, his mind already running through possibilities. A cold, maybe avian flu. The work never stopped, and neither did the worry. He paused for a moment, thinking about the animals he had treated over the years, the ones he had saved and the ones he could not. He wished he could have done more. He always wished that. He settled into the driver's seat, his expression heavy. As he pulled onto the road, his thoughts drifted. Somewhere along the way, he felt like he had found something worth holding onto in this line of work, a shared understanding with the creatures he treated. But as he entered a tunnel, something felt off. He thought he heard a voice, faint and impossible. He told himself he was imagining things. Then the world around him started to change. The tunnel grew darker than it should have been. Strange lights flickered at the edges of his vision, and sounds that did not belong crept in from nowhere. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. He wondered if the exhaustion had finally caught up to him, if the long hours were making him see things that were not there. A memory surfaced unbidden. Someone had once confronted him, furious, demanding to know how a doctor could justify killing healthy animals. The accusation had cut deep, and even now, it stirred something painful inside him. Guilt, frustration, the weight of choices that never felt clean. Before he could process any of it, everything shifted. The road, the tunnel, the car, all of it was gone. Kazami found himself somewhere else entirely, surrounded by nothing. No light, no sound. He stepped out, bewildered, and the ground beneath him felt wrong, unstable, like it might give way at any moment. He stumbled forward and was met with a landscape that defied every rule he knew. His stomach turned. He could not believe what he was seeing. Then, people appeared. A group approached him, led by a lavishly dressed figure who greeted him warmly, addressing him with a reverential title. They called him Jui-sama and asked about his well-being as though they had been expecting him. Kazami stood frozen, wide-eyed, struggling to make sense of it. These people knew him, or at least they knew what he was supposed to be. He looked around, taking in the scene. The figures surrounding him were unlike anyone he had ever met. Some had animal ears, others carried weapons, and among them moved creatures that should not have existed. A young woman with blonde braided hair stepped forward and spoke to him in English, acknowledging how strange it must be to use that language here, but greeting him formally all the same. Kazami could barely respond. His mind raced, trying to reconcile everything he was seeing: the fantastical figures, the fairies drifting through the air, the impossible reality that had swallowed his ordinary life whole. Kazami noticed it almost immediately. The blonde girl, Khloe, was staring at him with eyes that practically sparkled. There was a reverence in her gaze that made him deeply uncomfortable. He had no idea what he had done to deserve that kind of look. Before he could dwell on it, another figure stepped forward. Urus Rahl Maguire, the crown prince and acting prime minister, approached him and explained in Japanese that they were at a villa on the outskirts of the imperial city. Kazami, flustered and still trying to get his bearings, asked the prince to at least tell him his name. Urus introduced himself formally and asked Kazami to lend his strength for the sake of the country. The request only deepened Kazami's confusion. He managed to introduce himself in return, shaking Urus's hand with a hesitant smile. Khloe stood nearby, cheerful as ever, and the view behind them opened up to a sprawling landscape with a castle in the distance. But Kazami was not ready to play along. He pushed back, his face tight with worry. He told them this was too sudden, that he had a family, a life, and a job back home. He could not just abandon all of that. Urus tried to calm him down, promising that he would be given proper compensation, food, clothing, and a place to stay. Kazami pressed further, asking whether the summoning was real and whether there was any way to send him back. Urus admitted the truth. Their summoner, Riru, was out of commission and would not recover for at least a month. There was no quick way home. The weight of that answer hit Kazami hard. He was stuck here, chosen as a so-called unique person, and everyone was looking at him like he was supposed to save them. He could feel their eyes on him, watching, evaluating. It made his skin crawl. "I'm just a vet," he said, the frustration spilling out. He was not a hero, not a leader. He was an ordinary man who treated animals for a living. But Urus would not let it go. He lowered his head and laid out the reality of what his people were facing. Plague and starvation were tearing the region apart. People were dying, and no one had the knowledge to stop it. The prince described a world that had stagnated under suffering. Children were being abandoned, thrown into slavery because their families could not feed them. Entire communities were wasting away. Yuri spoke with a mix of humility and desperation as he pleaded for Kazami's help, even if sending him home could not happen right away. The people around them, maids and knights, some with animal ears and tails, stood in respectful silence. All of them were watching, waiting, ready to support whatever Kazami decided. He looked at their faces and felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. In the end, Kazami gave in, though not without reservation. He agreed to help while preparations for his return were being made. It was not a promise to save the world. It was a reluctant step forward, taken by a man who knew he was in over his head, but could not bring himself to walk away. Urus thanked him with genuine relief and assured him the entire household would be at his disposal. Kazami stood among them, caught between their hope and his own doubts, committed to doing what he could even as his reservations refused to quiet down. Dhoni wasted no time. With a cheerful grin, he told Kazami he would be leaving things in his capable hands and squeezed him like they were old friends. Before Kazami could even react, the Lord was already on his way out. Kazami stood there, stunned. The man had just dumped every troublesome problem in his lap and walked away, smiling. Khloe stepped up nervously, tripping over her own words as she asked for his care, biting her tongue mid-sentence. Kazami tried to keep it together, but the doubt hit him hard. He was one veterinarian in a world he did not understand. Could a single vet really save this country? The answer was obvious to him. Absolutely impossible. 1 month passed. Khloe approached Kazami and asked if he was feeling all right. He brushed it off, insisting it was nothing. She did not let him dwell on it. She told him to hurry, bringing out a stack of teaching materials, and declared what they would cover that day. Her enthusiasm was relentless. The luxurious room around him only made things worse. Kazami had never felt comfortable in these surroundings, and the mountains of study materials piling up around him did not help. He joked that he had an allergy to studying, but Khloe was not deterred. She suggested they start with things he already knew, easing him in gently. Kazami wondered what exactly he was supposed to know about this world. Khloe explained that foundational knowledge was everything. He needed to learn the language, understand the customs, and even pick up martial arts. These were not optional. They were survival skills in this world. Kazami's eyes lit up when he asked about magic. That was the one thing about being in another world that actually excited him, but Khloe corrected his expectations. Magic in this world operated under something called law, a system that governed physical phenomena. It was nothing like the flashy spells he had imagined. The full weight of the curriculum became clear, and Kazami's spirits sank. He tried to think of shortcuts, wondering if magic could be used for communication or some kind of humanitarian work instead. Khloe was not having it. She committed to an intense, month-long schedule of continuous instruction to get him up to speed as fast as possible. Kazami groaned under the pressure and eventually pretended to feel sick, hoping for a way out. Khloe took him seriously and was ready to call for a doctor before he could stop her. His days became a blur of relentless study. He had two instructors. Khloe, who used the law of light, taught him with warmth and patience. His other teacher, Khloe, who specialized in the ice law, was precise, disciplined, and far less forgiving. Between the two of them, Kazami had no room to breathe. He found himself daydreaming about discovering some hidden ability, some unique power that would let him make a real difference without drowning in textbooks. Then, Khloe mentioned something that snapped him out of it. She told him there was an outdoor assignment coming up. Kazami could barely contain himself. After weeks locked inside studying, the idea of stepping outside felt like salvation. Khloe explained the situation. The Empire used griffins in warfare, magnificent magical beasts that were nearly impossible to tame. But recently, a tamed griffin had suddenly died, and no one knew why. She asked Kazami to look into it, to use his expertise to figure out what was killing them and prevent it from happening again. Griffins were rare and valuable, and losing them was something the Empire could not afford. Kazami understood the stakes, but he also questioned how harshly the breeders were being punished for the deaths, suggesting that fear was not the answer. Still, his mind was already working. This was what he knew. This was what he was built for. For the first time since arriving in this world, he was approaching a problem like a veterinarian, and it felt right. Khloe laid out the full scope of what was at stake. A single griffin had the battle capability of a medium-sized troop. Losing one did not just mean losing an animal, it meant losing the equivalent of hundreds of soldiers. The weight of that number was not lost on Kazami. He understood the severity and told her he wanted to investigate further. Too many lives depended on these creatures to ignore what was happening to them. But Kazami pushed the conversation further. He argued that simply punishing the breeders would not solve anything. They needed to find the root cause, something that would protect both the people and the griffins. He asked for a chance to do exactly that, and his voice carried a conviction that had been absent since he arrived in this world. Khloe studied him for a moment, then agreed. She told him she would make the arrangements to guide him directly. Kazami turned to Khloe and apologized, asking if they could put the studies on hold for a while. Khloe accepted without hesitation. She told him she admired what he was doing, that helping others outside the castle was exactly what a Marabito should be doing. Their conversation drifted to the legends of this world. Khloe spoke about the great figures of the past, heroes who had ridden dragons into battle and reshaped entire nations. She used the titles Jui-sama and unique person with a reverence that made Kazami uneasy. These were the kinds of people he was being compared to, legendary warriors and leaders who had changed the course of history. Kazami's response was honest. He told her he was not that kind of person. His experience was with animal autopsies, not battlefields. He was a veterinarian, not a hero. The gap between what they expected and what he actually was felt enormous. Still, as he thought about the griffin assignment ahead, his nerves crept in. He considered the tools he had at his disposal and knew they were limited. Khloe tried to reassure him, reminding him of his title as Jui-sama, a word that carried respect and high expectations in this world. She believed in him, even if he did not believe in himself. Kazami felt the pressure of that faith pressing down on him, heavy and unrelenting, but he swallowed it and prepared to move forward. Khloe moved through the castle corridors with quiet confidence, a book tucked under his arm and a calm smile on his face. When he reached the outer gate, the guards tensed up. One of them tried to stop him, barking that they could not allow a butler through. Another guard quickly shut him down, explaining that this was no butler. This was Khloe, an imperial knight who reported directly to the royal family. The first guard went pale and stammered an apology as Khloe passed through without breaking stride. He entered the office where Eurus sat behind a desk, his long hair framing a composed expression. Khloe reported that Kazami was making his way to the griffon breeding grounds. He added that there was a condition attached. Kazami had requested leniency for the breeders until the true cause of death could be determined. Eurus smiled and told him there was no problem. The assignment was not scheduled until the following day, so there was time. The conversation shifted to what they actually expected from Kazami. Khloe began to voice a doubt, suggesting that the man was, after all, just a doctor. But Eurus cut through the hesitation. He pulled out a graph that charted population changes alongside disease outbreaks across the territory. The numbers were grim. Sickness had been surging, and not just from the usual causes like war. Respiratory and digestive diseases were tearing through the population at an alarming rate. The mortality figures alone were enough to change anyone's perspective. Eurus explained the connection that made Kazami so critical. A large portion of these diseases were being spread by animals, livestock, wild creatures. The very things the people depended on for survival were also killing them. No one in this world had the knowledge to address that problem. No one, except a veterinarian. Khloe listened carefully as Eurus laid out the reasoning. A competent vet could do what no healer, knight, or lord had managed. He could attack the diseases at their source. Eurus leaned back, and for a moment, the careful politician gave way to something more genuine. "When I just think of it," he said, "even my heart starts to dance." The hope in his voice was unmistakable. He handed Khloe a letter and instructed him to deliver it to Shingo personally. Outside the castle walls, the Austra Kingdom's imperial city was alive with movement. Guards stood at their posts while the streets buzzed with activity. Somewhere in the middle of it all, Kazami walked among the people, taking in the sights with a curious eye, quietly absorbing the world he had been thrown into. Kazami spotted a ferry drifting through the air nearby, and his eyes went wide. He called out that he was coming and took off after it. Khloe acknowledged him from behind, and someone called out his name, waving him over. His bodyguard Nora reacted with surprise at his sudden burst of energy, while Liz Vert-Serve watched from a distance with a skeptical look. She remarked on how easily he seemed to get along with everyone, her tone flat and unimpressed. The two of them, Nora and Liz, had been assigned as Kazami's personal bodyguards. The group eventually made their way toward the griffin breeding grounds. Along the path, Kazami and Khloe admired the plants growing around them. Kazami pointed out how many of them looked similar to what he knew from his own world. Khloe mentioned that wheat, for instance, had originally been introduced by a previous Marabito. Then, Kazami noticed an oleander plant and recognized they were getting close to the barn. A bald man met them at the entrance, told them he had been expecting their arrival, and led the group inside. The moment Kazami saw the griffins, he lost all composure. He could not contain his excitement. These were real, living griffins, and he was standing right in front of them. Khloe quickly warned him not to enter the enclosure, reminding him that griffins were dangerous beasts, but it was already too late. By the time she finished the warning, Kazami was inside, approaching the creatures and calling them good boys. Khloe and the others froze in shock. The griffins, however, did not attack. Kazami stood among them, puzzled by the idea that they were supposed to be aggressive. They seemed calm, even affectionate. Liz kept her hand near her weapon, mentioning she was ready to cut them down if anything went wrong, which only made the others more nervous. But the handler confirmed it. The griffins were gentle. Kazami marveled at how different these magical beasts were from the legends. Their temperament was nothing like what he had been told. The mood shifted when Liz led them to the griffin that had died suddenly. Before Kazami began the examination, Khloe asked if she could have one of the large feathers. She explained that materials from magical beasts could be used to craft equipment. Kazami compared it to a crafting system from a game he used to play and found the idea fascinating. Then he got to work. He asked Khloe for her assistance and instructed the staff to clear the area. He laid out his medical tools carefully, and Liz was given the task of recording notes during the autopsy. She examined the tools with interest, testing their sharpness. Kazami warned everyone that what he was about to do involved opening the creature up completely, and anyone who could not stomach it should step away. As the work began, Liz showed no sign of discomfort. If anything, she seemed genuinely engaged. She admitted that she found this kind of investigation interesting. Kazami noticed her enthusiasm and could not help but smile. It was a small thing, but for the first time, the cold night showed a side of herself that felt almost human. Kazami worked through the autopsy methodically, examining the griffin's organs one by one. He found intestinal parasites, but no water accumulation in the abdomen, which ruled out several possibilities. Liz kept careful notes beside him, while Khloe and the others watched from a distance, visibly unsettled by the sight. Kazami observed aloud that the griffin's internal structure resembled large cat-type animals from Earth. His knowledge was applicable here. That realization gave him confidence. The conversation turned to what the griffins had been eating. The caretaker explained that they were fed furball rabbits, small creatures that served as their primary food source. Kazami questioned the man further, pressing for details about the rabbits themselves. It turned out that the rabbits had been dying suddenly as well, and the grass they were being fed had not been properly maintained. Kazami's expression changed. The food source was the problem. Whatever was killing the rabbits was being passed on to the griffins. He told them immediately that the griffins could not be allowed to eat any more of those rabbits. The urgency in his voice was unmistakable. The group sprang into action, deciding to head to the hunting grounds to stop the feeding. Liz and Nora moved ahead to prepare, while Kazami followed close behind. When they reached the open field, Kazami asked where the rabbits were. The caretaker told him they had already been released for the griffins to hunt. Kazami's heart sank. He knew how dangerous these magical creatures could be, and now he had to get the rabbits away from them before more damage was done. Chaos broke out almost immediately. The furball rabbits had a defensive ability, a magical reflection technique that activated when they were threatened. It misfired wildly, sending bursts of energy in random directions. Kazami ducked and scrambled through the confusion, worried about both the rabbits and his own safety. Liz and Nora organized the others to begin capturing the remaining rabbits, while Kazami chased down the ones closest to the griffins. He managed to grab one and held it close. It was shaken but only bumped, not seriously hurt. The others continued rounding up more, but a griffin swooped in and snatched one before anyone could reach it. Kazami watched helplessly as an older rabbit tried to approach the griffin, and he wondered if it was the captured one's parent. He quickly realized there was no way to take food from a griffin mid-meal. That was a fight he could not win, but the experience had given him what he needed. Standing in the field with the pieces falling into place, Kazami began to see a path toward a solution. The problem was in the food chain. Fix the rabbits, fix the griffins. For the first time, the answer felt within reach. Kazami steadied himself and prepared to throw one of the furball rabbits. He told himself it would work. It had to. He launched it into the air with everything he had, shouting as he let it go. The small creature soared toward one of the griffins, and the beast's eyes locked onto it instantly. The rabbit collided with the griffin mid-flight, and the two tangled together in a burst of movement. Kazami let out a triumphant yell as he dove in and managed to grab the rabbit before it could be snatched. The little creature let out a soft cry as it landed safely in his arms. Another one tumbled off to the side, startled but unharmed. Then 2 more griffins appeared, closing in fast. Kazami stood his ground, gripping a rope with both hands. He acknowledged their arrival under his breath and braced himself. He swung the rope, trying to keep the griffins at bay, but the situation was slipping. He was running out of rope and running out of options. One more encounter, and he would have no choice but to run. Before it came to that, the ground beneath the griffins erupted. Massive pillars of rock shot upward from the earth, a law magic spell that froze the beasts in place without injuring them. Kazami stared in disbelief. Liz stepped forward, calm and composed. She told him she had not harmed the griffins, only immobilized them. Kazami thanked her, genuinely impressed. That kind of precision was exactly what he would expect from someone of her rank. Liz stood there with quiet confidence, while Khloe rushed in from behind, her voice tight with worry, demanding to know if Kazami was safe. Their attention turned to an injured furball rabbit. Khloe told them she could heal it using her law. Kazami watched closely, asking whether there would be any swelling or changes after the healing was complete. Khloe admitted she did not fully understand the theoretical side of how her power worked. That only made Kazami more interested. He wanted to see the process firsthand. He suggested they head to the dissection room so he could observe the effects of the healing right away. As they walked, his mind was already racing ahead. He thought about microbiology, about sterilization, about practices that might not even exist in this world yet. The implications were enormous. He told Khloe he would explain everything in detail later. As they neared a building, Kazami noticed it was louder than expected. Something was going on inside. When they entered, they found Eurus already there, accompanied by a group of spectators. The prince had brought an audience. Kazami realized this was not just an investigation anymore. It had turned into something closer to a formal hearing, a quasi-court session tied to the griffin's death. Kazami approached Eurus and remarked on his bold decision to set this up. questioning with a dry smile whether the prince was enjoying himself. The connection became clear. If Kazami could prove what had actually killed the griffin, the breeders who had been blamed and imprisoned could go free. His expression shifted. There was a life on the line, and he had the evidence to save it. He steadied himself and prepared to present his findings, ready to prove what he had discovered. Kazami held up a sprig of leaves and declared that this was the answer: oleander. The plant they had passed on the way to the griffin barn was the source of all of it. The room went quiet. Khloe recognized it immediately, her eyes widening as the connection hit her. Kazami explained that oleander was lethally toxic, even in tiny amounts. For a small animal weighing around a kilogram, just a few dried leaves would be enough to kill it. The furball rabbits had been grazing on grass contaminated with oleander. They ate the poison, and then the griffins ate the rabbits. The toxin passed up the food chain, accumulating with each step. That was what had been killing the griffins. Not neglect, not disease, but a plant that no one in this world had thought to identify as dangerous. The weight of the discovery settled over the room. Kazami proposed a plan. They did not need to clear all the vegetation. The solution was targeted. Remove the oleander, create dedicated pastures for the rabbits where the plant could not grow, and the cycle would be broken. Eurus listened carefully and acknowledged the logic with a simple nod. It was practical, efficient, and it made sense. Eurus addressed the room and stated that once the findings were investigated and confirmed, the imprisoned breeder would be released. The man had been wrongfully blamed. The real culprit was a plant, not a person. A thorough follow-up investigation would make it official. One of the caretakers spoke up, his voice cracking with urgency. He wanted to know what they should do about the rabbits that were already showing strange symptoms. Kazami told him they needed to examine those animals carefully. If the contamination had spread far enough, it could become a serious problem, and replacing the affected rabbits with healthy ones would be the safest course of action. The conversation shifted as Kazami took the opportunity to introduce a concept that was entirely foreign to this world. He explained disinfection, the killing and removal of organisms so small they could not be seen with the naked eye, microorganisms and bacteria. He described what they did, how they spread, and why eliminating them mattered. He used the healing they had witnessed earlier as a starting point, walking them through how the body's internal processes worked on a level no one here had ever considered. The room listened with a mix of fascination and confusion as he gestured through the explanation. By the time the tension finally eased, the mood had shifted completely. A furball rabbit had climbed onto Kazami's head and was sitting there contentedly, refusing to move. Someone pointed it out with a laugh, noting that the creature seemed to have chosen its new favorite spot. Kazami sighed, realizing he had apparently gained a new responsibility on top of everything else. The group exchanged warm smiles and words of encouragement around him. It was a small moment, but after everything they had been through, it felt earned. The griffins were safe, the breeder would go free, and for the first time, the people around Kazami were beginning to see what a veterinarian from another world could actually do. With the griffin case behind him, Kazami threw himself into new work. He stood among his companions, the furball rabbit perched comfortably on his shoulder, surrounded by familiar faces. Liz approached him, her ears twitching, and addressed him by his formal title. He told her to drop the formalities and just call him by name. She did not seem particularly bothered either way. Kazami had set up a small workspace and was deep into experiments, working on deriving compounds from morphine. The process was delicate, and the smell filled the room. One of the girls fanned herself beside him, barely hiding her exasperation. He explained that the precision required for this kind of medicinal work was no different from cooking. Every measurement had to be exact. Liz watched him with a skeptical look, remarking that his methods were strange for someone who was supposed to be a doctor and not an apothecary. He walked them through the logic. Estimating the right dosage of medicinal ingredients was critical. Too much, and a cure became a poison. Too little, and it did nothing at all. To prove the point, he demonstrated on mice, carefully administering a dose and having the others observe the results. Liz made a dry comment about the irony of what they were doing, noting how thin the line was between healing and killing. Kazami did not argue. He acknowledged the harsh reality of it. Every trial, every test was necessary if he wanted to save lives on a larger scale. Sometimes that meant getting his hands dirty. The moment was interrupted when someone burst through the door in a panic, voice raised with worry. It broke the tension and brought a brief flash of humor to the room before the mood settled back down. Later, Kazami sat slumped over his study material materials, visibly drained. The endless lessons on language, customs, and the workings of this world had worn him thin. He asked if he could step out of the room for a while, desperate for a break from the constant instruction. Before long, Khloe arrived with tea and sat down across from him. She brought something else too. A new request had come in. There was an outbreak of a mysterious disease called ghoul in a distant region, and it was spreading. She explained the details as Kazami listened, his fatigue giving way to focus. The symptoms were unusual, and no one in the area had been able to identify the cause. An investigation was needed, and they wanted him to take it on. Kazami's eyes sharpened. Another case, another mystery. The griffins had been the first test. This would be the next. He could feel the pull of it already, the same instinct that had driven him through every diagnosis he had ever made. Somewhere out there, animals and people were suffering from something no one understood, and he was the only one in this world who might have the knowledge to figure it out. The explanation of ghouls went deeper than Kazami expected. He was told that ghouls were originally humans or animals that had been transformed into flesh-eating beasts. The causes varied. Necromancers could trigger it, and so could a demonic beast known as the Hydra. Kazami listened with sharp attention, asking about the nature of the transformation. The answer was grim. It started with symptoms that looked like a common cold. Then, the infected lost control of themselves, turning violent. Eventually, their bodies changed entirely, and the stench of rotting flesh followed. People in the affected regions treated it as either an epidemic or a curse, and neither explanation offered any comfort. The conversation turned darker still. Someone raised the possibility of military intervention, suggesting that the infected divisions might need to be handled by force, and that burning an entire city could become necessary if the situation spiraled. Kazami sat across the table, his face tight with concern. The scale of the threat was far beyond anything he had dealt with before. As they prepared for the trip, Kazami noted something that still unsettled him about this world. It had a slave system. The people who would be traveling with him, the knights who would guard him, many of them were slaves bound by contract. Christ explained the hierarchy further, detailing how the slave knight order operated. He mentioned that Lord Dhoni, as a powerful noble, had the authority to summon and deploy these knights as he saw fit. The trip would include members of that order. Kazami took the information in with quiet unease. The preparations were interrupted when a young griffin burst through the door and tumbled into the room, sending everyone nearby scrambling. The creature flapped and stumbled around, demanding attention with reckless energy. Kazami watched the chaos and decided to use the moment. If these young griffins were going to be around, they might as well start getting used to people. He treated it as an impromptu training session, observing their behavior, while the others tried to wrangle the creature back under control. Outside the mansion, the tone shifted entirely. A group of knights gathered and discussed their strategy. Patrols needed to be maintained, and there were threats that still needed to be dealt with. Liz took charge, announcing her intention to personally crush one of the remaining enemy bases. Within the group, the knights talked openly about their roles and the dangers ahead. Some expressed concern, while others traded jabs about one of their members, teasing about looks in a way that cut through the tension. Glenn, the vice captain, stepped in and brought the discussion back to practical matters. He argued for a clear division of responsibilities. Someone needed to stay behind and guard the mansion, while the others handled the direct confrontations. He pushed for a decision that kept the right people in the right places, leaving the combat assignments to those best suited for them. The knights fell in line, and the plan was set. That night, Liz stood outside the mansion and confirmed she would take care of things on her end. Before leaving, she turned to Quina and told her she would be in charge of the house for the day. It was a lot of responsibility for someone so young, but Liz did not linger on it. She had her own mission to handle. Inside, the preparations for Kazami's departure continued. The items he had requested were brought in, and the plan was explained. He would be dressed as a knight to blend in during the trip. Kazami blinked in surprise, asking if he really needed to change his appearance that much. The next morning, Nora arrived with energy to spare, insisting she help him get dressed. Kazami turned red and declined, telling her he could manage on his own. She did not take it personally. Instead, she wandered over to the large bed in his room and admired it openly, remarking on how comfortable it looked and hinting that she would not mind being invited there sometime. Kazami's face tightened. He told her he would handle the changing himself and left it at that. They traded back and forth in a lighthearted exchange. Kazami struggled with the knight's armor, complaining that it rubbed against his waist and that he clearly was not built for this kind of outfit. Nora sat on the edge of the bed and suggested they could do something right now, her eagerness outpacing any subtlety. Kazami shot her a look half annoyed, half amused, and she stood up without argument. They moved on to easier conversation, talking about food and the plants Kazami had noticed around the area. The rapport between them was easy, even if the tension underneath was not. When the time came to leave, the group confirmed that all equipment was ready. They loaded into a horse-drawn carriage and set off. Kazami sat inside, watching the landscape pass, and let his mind turn inward. He thought about what lay ahead. He was not a legendary warrior. He was not a dragon rider or a nation builder like the Marabito who had come before him. He was a veterinarian, and that was all he had ever been. But maybe that was enough. Maybe, in a world full of disease and suffering, the thing they needed most was not another hero with a sword, but someone who understood why things got sick and how to make them well again. The carriage rolled on toward Hydra, and Kazami stared at the road ahead, wondering what was waiting for him there. Before all of this, before the journey and the investigations and the weight of a world she barely understood, Khloe had stood at the Hydra church headquarters. She had been praised for her accomplishments and told about the role she was being given. She would serve as an attached, a protector assigned to a unique person, a Marabito summoned from another world. The white robe she wore marked her as an officer of outstanding performance, and she accepted the mission with solemn resolve, telling them she would fulfill it, even at the cost of her life. The elders stressed that the bond between an attached and their charge transcended power and pride. It was the foundation of everything. They selected their attached carefully, and Khloe had been chosen from millions. Now, that mission had carried her all the way to Hydra. As the city came into view, Khloe explained to Kazami that the name came from the dragon-type beasts, the Hydra that once lived in the area. Generations ago, the district chief had driven them out, and the city had been built on the land they left behind. It was a bustling place, full of visitors and steeped in history. At the gates, Lord Dhoni asked Lavaine and his wife Sandra welcomed them personally. Dhoni greeted the group with warmth and assured them that any troubles they brought could be solved within his city. Kazami stepped forward, introduced himself, and thanked the chief for his hospitality. He stated plainly that he was there to investigate the ghoul outbreak. Dhoni seemed impressed by how much Kazami's command of the local language had improved. They were led to Dhoni's home, and the opulence hit Kazami the moment he walked in. The room was extravagant, more lavish than anything he had ever known. He compared it quietly to his simple apartment back in Japan and almost laughed at the difference. A portrait on the wall caught his eye, showing Dhoni, his family, and their idealized, beautified appearances. Dhoni offered the full range of his hospitality, suggesting dinner after a bath and hinting at more indulgent entertainments for his guest. Kazami shut that down without hesitation, telling him he preferred things gentle and easygoing. Someone nearby expressed relief, assuring Kazami that the ghoul investigation could wait until the following day, and that tonight was for rest. Outside, the two baby griffins, Guri and Gura, sat bored under a tree, creating a brief moment of quiet amusement. Inside, Kazami sat with Dhoni over tea, his frustration simmering. He wanted to start the investigation immediately, but the delay had been imposed on him. He went along with it, took the bath he was offered, and felt the tension in his body ease as the hot water did its work. Refreshed but restless, he headed toward the grand dining room. His mind refused to let go of the task ahead. The ghouls were out there, and every hour that passed without answers was an hour wasted. Kazami stepped into the dining room and stopped. Khloe and Nora were already there, and they looked nothing like their usual selves. Khloe wore an elegant dress that caught the light, and even Nora, standing beside her with her rabbit ears and a more casual outfit, looked like she had put in real effort. Kazami's face flushed before he could stop it. He quietly thanked whatever forces were responsible for the view and wondered if this was all for the dinner or if something bigger was planned. The table was set beautifully, loaded with gourmet dishes that someone had clearly spent hours preparing. Dhoni wasted no time. He launched into an enthusiastic conversation with Kazami, pouring drinks and talking without pause. Kazami noticed how much thought had gone into everything: the food, the drink, the atmosphere. He appreciated it, even if he wished the Lord's intentions were purely generous. Khloe drifted over to speak with Sandra, Dhoni's wife, while someone nearby muttered that Dhoni had started up again, clearly tired of the man's relentless hosting. Kazami reached his limit with the small talk. He decided the only way to shut Dhoni down was to beat him at his own game. He challenged the Lord to a drinking contest, telling himself he would outlast him no matter what. The resolve was there, even if the confidence was not. They went back and forth, glass after glass, until the table was littered with empty bottles. In the end, Kazami slumped forward and declared that he had won. He was barely conscious, but the victory was his. Afterward, he stumbled out of the dining room, admitting to anyone who would listen that he was genuinely dying. Someone offered to help him to his room, but he waved them off and said he would manage. Nora caught up to him and teased about the good wine he had been drinking, then joked about filling the empty space in his bed. Kazami brushed it off without much energy, too drained to care. Meanwhile, in another part of the house, a quieter conversation was happening. Sandra sat with Khloe in a formal setting, and the younger woman's nerves were written all over her face. Sandra spoke with the calm authority of someone who had lived through everything she was describing. She explained how political marriages worked in their world, how alliances were formed between families through arrangement rather than love. She mentioned casually that her own marriage to the Levain house had been decided by their parents. Khloe listened carefully, but the weight on her mind was obvious. She confessed that she was afraid of not meeting Kazami's expectations, of falling short of the role she had been given. Sandra's response was firm but kind. She told Khloe that understanding what a man needed and being willing to act on it was more important than perfection. Flexibility and initiative mattered more than ideals. The conversation carried an undercurrent of something larger. Sandra encouraged Khloe to change, to use the opportunity she had been given rather than let it pass out of fear. She promised to help, noting that their situations were not so different. By the time they finished, Khloe's anxiety had not vanished, but it had loosened enough for her to breathe. The two women prepared for whatever came next, finding small moments of humor between the heavier truths they had shared. Kazami was still awake when the knock came. A nervous voice on the other side of the door asked if he was sleeping. He told her he was still up and invited her to speak. It was Khloe. She stepped inside, her cheeks flushed and her words unsteady. She asked if he would listen to what she had to say, her voice carrying the courage of someone who had been talked into something she was not entirely ready for. They ended up sitting on the edge of the bed, both visibly uncomfortable. Kazami could feel the tension in the room and recognized exactly what kind of situation this was. He kept his composure on the outside, but inside his thoughts were racing. Khloe was 15. He reminded himself of that and told himself to act like the adult in the room. He spoke calmly, telling her that she was not bothering him, but his tone was careful, measured. Khloe leaned closer, still blushing, and the movement caught them both off balance. They fell backward onto the bed together. Kazami apologized immediately, and Khloe stammered that it was fine, her face burning. Neither of them handled the moment gracefully. Kazami did what he always did when things got complicated. He changed the subject. He started talking about his work, explaining what it meant to be a veterinarian in his world. Khloe's embarrassment faded as curiosity took over. She asked about the role and what made it important. He walked her through it. Veterinary medicine had a long history. It started with the care of military horses during wartime and grew from there into something far larger. He explained that vets did not just treat sick animals. They prevented diseases from jumping between animals and humans. They improved agriculture by keeping livestock healthy. They dealt with threats that most people never even knew existed, invisible causes of illness that could wipe out entire populations if left unchecked. Khloe listened intently, but when the conversation turned to the Hydra Church's beliefs, her expression shifted. In this world, many illnesses were seen as acts of divine influence, punishments, or tests from higher powers. Khloe understood the doctrine, but did not hold it with absolute conviction. Kazami pushed gently against that way of thinking. He introduced the concept of hygiene, the idea that cleanliness and prevention could do what prayers alone could not. He was careful not to be dismissive, but the point was clear. The unseen causes of disease were not divine. They were physical, and they could be fought with knowledge. Kazami could feel it. Somewhere in Khloe's mind, she had built him into something far more than what he was. The way she looked at him, the reverence in her voice, it was not just respect. She had placed him on a pedestal so high that it made his chest tighten with a mix of embarrassment and unease. Khloe told him with fierce enthusiasm that he had a strong heart, that he was the kind of person this world needed. Kazami did not know what to do with that. He asked her, carefully, what exactly she thought he was. She blushed and called him a wonderful person, her sincerity so intense it felt almost dangerous. Khloe declared that she would protect him, even if it meant giving up her own life. She said it was her duty, her purpose. Kazami pushed back gently. He told her he was not doing anything special. He was just doing what any decent person would do in his position. But Khloe's expression did not waver. To her, his role in this world was something far greater than he was willing to admit. Kazami wrestled with it internally. He was not used to being treated like this. Back home, he had been ordinary, a veterinary student with a small apartment and a quiet life. The weight of being seen as someone extraordinary sat heavy on him, and he had to remind himself to keep breathing through it. Khloe's mood shifted. She spoke about the dangers of being pulled into another world, a hint of worry creeping into her voice. Kazami acknowledged the risks honestly. He told her he understood what he was facing and that he intended to contribute whatever he could, no matter what it cost. That seemed to settle something inside her. Her worry hardened into resolve. She told herself she had to make sure Kazami stayed connected to this world, that he did not slip away. Then the atmosphere changed again. Khloe moved closer, her courage outpacing her composure. She told him not to think about anything. Kazami's pulse spiked. He could tell something was off about her tonight, something bolder and more reckless than usual. He tried to redirect, suggesting she drink some water to calm down. Khloe refused and asked for wine instead. She was already tipsy, and her confidence was running on borrowed fuel. Kazami pointed out her age, but she brushed it off without a second thought. He poured her a drink, wincing at the thought of what another round would do to his already battered liver. Khloe insisted they share it, and Kazami gave in, overwhelmed by her persistence. As the drinking continued, she told him she wanted to deepen the bond between them. Kazami could not figure out how a conversation about veterinary medicine had spiraled into this. Khloe asked him to relax, her voice softer now, tender in a way that caught him off guard. She reassured him that everything was all right. Then, with a determination that left no room for misunderstanding, she told him to do as he wished with her. Kazami sat there, searching her face, and understood. This was not a game. It was not a whim. It was Khloe offering everything she had, holding nothing back, because she believed in him that completely. He accepted her sincerity for what it was, even if the situation itself was more than he knew how to handle. Then, Kazami did something only he would do. His eyes lit up, and he reached for Khloe's wrist. He told her to hold still and pressed his fingers against her pulse. Khloe froze, her face flushed, and asked if he was meditating. He smiled slightly and told her this was for medical purposes. He explained that alcohol raised the heart rate, and he wanted to see how it was affecting her. What had been an intimate moment turned into an impromptu examination. Kazami noted aloud the similarities between the bodies of people in this world and those from his own. The structures were close enough that his knowledge applied. Khloe's eyes went wide, and she let out a startled gasp, covering her mouth as the reality of what he was doing hit her. He was not seducing her, he was studying her. Kazami kept his composure. He told her gently that she should not tease an adult too much, and added, almost casually, that she was a cute girl. That only made things worse for Khloe. She squirmed as he continued checking anatomical details, her body reacting ticklishly to his clinical touch. When he was finished, he pulled back and told her it was late. She needed to rest. He said plainly that she should not spoil her body, and then he stood up and walked toward the door with a calm, unhurried stride. Khloe was left sitting on the bed, a storm of emotions crashing through her. Frustration, disappointment, confusion. She apologized to the empty room and questioned whether any of what had just happened had been real. Her thoughts spiraled inward. She had come here with a purpose. Sandra had told her to take initiative, to build a bond with Kazami that would make him want to stay. Khloe had summoned every ounce of courage she had. She had offered herself completely, and he had checked her pulse. The inadequacy she had always carried rose to the surface. She was just a priestess. He was someone the entire world was counting on. The gap between them felt impossible, and the rejection, however gentle it had been, stung in a way she could not shake. Her eyes widened as the full weight of it settled in. She had failed. Nearby, someone watched the scene without a word. They said nothing, offered no commentary, just stood as a quiet presence, while Khloe sat with her feelings and tried to figure out where to go from here. In the dim quiet of the Hydra church in Hydra, Khloe knelt alone. Her voice was barely a whisper as she called out to Riru, her superior, questioning whether she was truly capable of serving Kazami. The words came out broken, heavy with doubt. Everything she had tried that night had fallen apart, and now she was on her knees in the dark, begging for an answer. Far away at the church headquarters, Riru was fast asleep when the call reached her. She jolted awake, shouting Khloe's name before she was even fully conscious. The frustration hit her immediately. She sat up in the middle of the night, pulling at her hair, irritated by the situation that refused to move forward. The stagnation, the emotional mess, the constant feeling that nothing was progressing. It wore on her. Riru told Khloe to stop worrying and go back to sleep. Her tone was blunt, but not unkind. She reminded Khloe that being the attached was not the problem. Kazami was a kind person, and Khloe's dedication to serving him was not in question. But Khloe's voice cracked as she pushed further. She spoke about how much she wanted to support Kazami's work, how she would do anything for him. The emotion poured out unchecked, revealing the depth of her insecurity. Then, through tears, she admitted the truth. She did not want to give up her position. It was selfish. She knew that, but she could not let go. Riru's patience thinned. She scolded Khloe for letting the elder's words get inside her head and told her to stop wallowing. If she had strength, she should use it. Khloe needed to channel what she was feeling into something productive instead of crying in an empty church. Meanwhile, Riru muttered about wanting to go back to sleep, her annoyance only half serious. She pushed Khloe to recognize what she was capable of and to act on it. The next morning, Kazami was sleeping soundly on his comfortable futon when a sharp kick sent him tumbling awake. Riru stood over him, her expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. "Wake up, Kazami!" she snapped. The others in the room scrambled, some protesting that the kick was too harsh, but Riru did not care. She demanded a proper response from him, and the room erupted into a flurry of voices trying to answer her before Kazami could even get his bearings. As the chaos settled, Kazami's mind turned inward. He tried to piece together how things had reached this point. What had he done wrong? What had he missed? Riru did not give him long to think. She laid into him with barely contained exasperation, chastising herself as much as him for the mess they were all in. The source of her frustration was painfully clear. Kazami had been completely oblivious during his interactions with Khloe, and Riru could not believe she had to spell it out for him. Riru let out a long sigh and introduced herself properly. Riru List Ventia, Cardinal of the Hydra Church, and the person who had summoned Kazami to this world. She told him flatly that for someone regarded as an eminence, he was remarkably unsociable. She explained that she had been resting to recover the strength she had spent on the summoning, and that her sleep had been destroyed because of the mess he had made with Khloe. She looked at Khloe, who stood nearby with tears still in her eyes and embarrassment burning on her face, and told Kazami bluntly that the girl would seriously break if he did not handle this properly. Khloe flushed even deeper at the words. Kazami managed an awkward smile, unsure of what to say. Riru sent Khloe out of the room for what she called grown-up talk. Once they were alone, she stretched out on the couch and began explaining the bigger picture. The Hydra Church used summoning as a tool for maintaining balance and prosperity across the continent. It was not charity, it was strategy. Kazami sat across from her and listened carefully, absorbing how the church operated and what motivated its decisions. The conversation turned darker. Riru brought up the political pressures surrounding Kazami, the power struggles, the threats, the risk that someone might use hostages to control him. She explained that Khloe had developed her own approach to protecting Kazami from those kinds of authority constraints, acting not just as his translator and teacher, but as a shield between him and the forces that wanted to use him. Riru told Kazami not to misunderstand what Khloe had done the night before. Her actions were not impulsive. They were sincere, thought through, and born from a level of devotion that went far deeper than he realized. Kazami took that in quietly, his expression shifting as the weight of it settled. He thought about how desperate Khloe must have felt to go that far. When Khloe was called back into the room, Kazami spoke to her directly. He told her he would not get involved with a minor, no matter the circumstances. Khloe protested, insisting her age made her capable enough, but Kazami held firm. He told her that when the day came that she saw him as something other than an eminence, he would respond in kind. Until then, he valued her support and wanted her to know that she mattered to him. Khloe's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were not from rejection. She had been heard. The mood shifted as Khloe bounced back with startling speed. She declared with fierce energy that she would throw herself into helping him study, determined to support his understanding of this world with everything she had. Kazami broke into a sweat, overwhelmed by the sudden intensity. Riru watched the scene with amusement and remarked that once Kazami's status as eminence was officially confirmed, he would have both the church and the state pulling at him from every direction. She seemed to enjoy the thought. Elsewhere, in the slave night quarters, a quieter conversation unfolded. Nora found Quina sitting alone and questioned her with surprise, asking what she was doing there. Quina admitted she felt like she had failed. Her mission had not gone the way it was supposed to, and the weight of that failure sat heavy on her. Nora listened and understood. She did not lecture or push. She simply let Quina know that she was not alone, offering the kind of comfort that came from someone who understood exactly what it meant to fall short in a world that never stopped demanding more. Quina sat with her ears low, regret written across her face. She admitted quietly that all she had managed to do was buy a sword. She had not gathered any real intelligence, had not learned anything that mattered. When Nora pressed for details, the full picture came out. Quina had tracked down a lead and confronted someone, but the information she got was worthless. Worse, a man in the slums had offered to reveal more about where the ghouls were hiding, but only if she let him touch her. He had leered at her with a sickening grin, knowing she was a slave and thinking he could take advantage. Quina had tried to steel herself. She told herself she could endure it for the sake of the mission, but the moment his hand reached for her, something inside her snapped. She slapped it away and screamed. The disgust, the violation, the memory of everything she had been through, it all came rushing back at once. The man was arrested afterward, but the damage was done. Nora sat beside her and let her talk. Quina said what she always said. She hated men. She had come from a decent family, one with status and comfort, and all of it had been stripped away when she was sold into slavery. Now she was here, with nothing, and she could not even complete a simple task. She told Nora she had no good qualities, nothing worth holding on to. Nora disagreed. She told Quina she was cute, genuinely so, and that she had something rare. She knew the law, a skill most people in their position could only dream of. Quina looked at her like she had lost her mind, but Nora held firm. She reminded Quina that being assigned as the personal guard of Kazami, the Eminence, was not a punishment. It was an opportunity. Most of them would never get a chance like that. By morning, the tone had shifted. Kazami looked drained, the exhaustion of everything that had happened over the past days catching up with him. Someone nearby remarked on how rough he looked. But when the conversation turned to the ghoul situation, his expression changed. He straightened up and declared that he was ready to investigate. This was why he was here. He had knowledge from another world, knowledge that no one else in this place had, and he intended to use it. The ghouls were out there, people were suffering, and Kazami was done sitting on the sidelines. It was time to get to work. Kazami studied the layout of Hydra, noting the key locations including Dhoni's mansion and the industrial district near the edge of the city. The slums spread to the southeast, and that was where they needed to go. He told Liz to lead the way, and she agreed without hesitation. His goal was clear. He needed to understand how far the ghoul infection had spread and whether it could be stopped before the situation forced the authorities into something drastic. Liz explained the reality of it as they walked. The citizens of Hydra avoided dealing with ghouls because anyone who got close risked becoming one themselves. The fear of infection kept everyone at a distance, and the people in charge were no better. They refused to act openly because acknowledging the ghouls meant admitting the problem existed, and that would cause panic. The official response, if it came at all, would be brutal. The infected would be enslaved or killed, and entire neighborhoods would be burned to stop the spread. Kazami and Khloe both reacted with visible discomfort at the thought. Liz did not sugarcoat it. She remarked that sacrificing a few to save the many was how this world worked. The comment hit a nerve. Kazami pushed back, insisting that his intent was to save lives, not to accept their loss as inevitable. He was a veterinarian, not a soldier. His instinct was to diagnose and treat, not to cut away the infected and move on. As they talked, something clicked in his mind. The ghoul disease reminded him of rabies, the behavioral changes, the aggression, the transmission through contact. The similarities were too strong to ignore. If the infection worked the way he suspected, there might be a way to treat it, or at least prove it was not a death sentence. Liz noticed the shift in his tone and asked if he truly believed he could find a cure. Kazami told her he was not certain, but he was confident enough to try. The key was evidence. If they could prove to the authorities that the ghoul transformation could be reversed or halted, the army would have no reason to burn the town. That was the plan. Find proof before the fire came. Liz led them to the southeast quarter, where barricades had been set up to contain the affected area. The streets grew narrower and the air grew heavier. Khloe stayed close to Kazami, her determination to protect him burning as fiercely as ever. Liz warned them about the thugs that lurked in the slums, people who had nothing left to lose and would not think twice about attacking outsiders. At the barricade, they were met by guards. Liz coordinated with them and called in additional support from her subordinate knights. Khloe's worry was plain on her face, but Kazami reassured her. They pressed forward. The stench hit them almost immediately, a thick, rotting smell that clung to everything and signaled that ghouls had been active in the area. The group moved deeper into the grim landscape, every step tightening the tension around them as they entered territory that the rest of the city had chosen to abandon. As they moved deeper into the slums, Kazami began explaining his theory to the others. In his world, he told them, there were microbes that could take control of their host's behavior to spread themselves. The rabies virus was the clearest example. It attacked the brain, drove the infected animal into a frenzy, and compelled it to bite anything nearby. The biting was not random aggression. It was the virus ensuring its own survival by jumping to the next host. He described the image of a rabid wolf, foaming and snarling, and the parallels to ghouls were impossible to miss. He pushed the theory further. The rotting smell that ghouls carried might not be a side effect. It could be intentional, a way to attract scavengers and other creatures that would consume the decaying flesh and spread the infection through the food chain. What puzzled him was that despite the rot, ghouls could still move. In a normal body, once the nerves and muscles decayed, movement would stop. Something was keeping those systems active, even as the rest of the body fell apart. Khloe reminded him that this was exactly the kind of situation where his skills mattered. She told him eagerly that as a veterinarian, he had the ability to make the citizens feel safe. Kazami agreed. The filth of the slums and the complete absence of hygiene made it the perfect breeding ground for every kind of disease, not just ghouls. The smell alone told him that much. They walked through the rundown streets, and the isolation became more obvious with every step. Khloe pointed out that the townspeople were watching them from a distance, staying back because of their clothing. The slum had been cut off from the rest of the city, and the people inside knew it. No one came here willingly. Kazami considered approaching one of the locals for information, but before he could act, a noise startled a young boy hiding nearby. Liz moved instantly, her reflexes catching the child before he could bolt. There was a tense moment as Kazami and Liz assessed the situation. Liz leaned in and told them the boy could not fool her nose. She smelled blood on him, mixed with something else, something off. Kazami stepped forward calmly and crouched down to the boy's level. He told the child he was not there to hurt him. He only wanted to help. The boy was trembling, but he did not run. Kazami took his arm gently and examined the wound. It was fresh but manageable. He cleaned and treated it carefully, telling the boy to keep it covered and not to scratch it. Khloe offered to use her healing, but Kazami told her it was not needed for this. The boy hesitated, clearly afraid, but something about Kazami's manner broke through. He began to talk. He described a figure that had attacked his younger brother, someone with a wild, disheveled appearance who moved with unnatural violence. His brother had been bitten. The boy's voice shook as he said it, the fear of what that bite might mean written across his face. Kazami reassured him again, steady and certain, and the boy held on to that certainty like a lifeline. When the conversation ended, Liz handed the boy a reward for his cooperation. She kept her word, as she always did with the children of the slums. The information was another piece of the puzzle, and every piece brought them closer to understanding what they were dealing with. The group pressed on, the weight of what the boy had told them settling into silence as they continued deeper into the heart of the ghoul territory. Before letting the boy go, Liz pressed more money into his hands and told him it was fine to take it. She added something extra on top, saying she would not need it herself. She was a slave after all. The boy stared at the coins, then at her, unable to process the gesture. She told him bluntly to survive, to find something better than this. If the one they called the Great Savior succeeded, there might be a way out for people like him. The boy's expression cracked, and for the first time, something other than fear crossed his face. He had not expected kindness from a knight. The moment passed quickly. Liz's ears twitched. She mentioned a third-stage ghoul nearby, noting how dangerous it could be. Then, she heard something Kazami could not, a dog whistle cutting through the distance. She told the group to follow the sound. Kazami agreed without hesitation. They needed to get to the ghoul. He explained that capturing a live sample, or at least getting close enough to study one in its active state, was essential to proving that the disease could be cured. They broke into a run, the urgency driving every step. Khloe did not fully understand what Liz had heard at first, but she kept pace without question. The ghoul appeared ahead of them, guttural sounds spilling from its mouth as it lurched through the shadows. Kazami kept his focus, calculating the safest angle of approach, while the others fell into position around him. They pulled back briefly to plan. Kazami proposed using a bow to target the ghoul's head, but acknowledged that the creature's hardened skin made a clean shot difficult. Liz suggested a different approach. She could use her ice elemental law to freeze the ghoul in place, locking it down long enough for someone to land a decisive strike through the opening. The plan took shape quickly. They would lure the ghoul into a nearby shed and collapse the structure around it to limit its movement. Once it was contained, they could act. Kazami gave out additional orders. He told some of the knights to search the surrounding area for a cow showing specific symptoms, signs of the same parasitic infection he had been tracking. If the disease was spreading through the food chain the way he suspected, there would be evidence in the livestock as well. The biological investigation was not over. Understanding the ghoul itself was only half the picture. He needed to trace the infection back to its source. The group responded immediately. Liz's knights moved with sharp discipline, splitting off to carry out their assignment assignments without a moment of hesitation. Khloe stood ready beside Kazami, her expression tight with determination. Everyone knew what was at stake. The ghoul was close, the plan was set, and there was no room for second thoughts. They moved forward together, courage and strategy carrying them into the fight they had been building toward since they first entered the slums. Before the fight began, Kazami took a moment to explain something the people of this world had never heard of. He told Khloe and the others about germs and viruses, invisible organisms that invaded the body and caused disease. No one here had any concept of them, but the body, he explained, was not defenseless. It came equipped with a system designed to fight back against these invaders. He called it the immune system, and he told Khloe and Nora that their abilities, the healing law, and their physical enhancements were exactly the kind of tools that could strengthen it. Khloe listened with wide eyes and promised to do everything she could. Someone confirmed that the preparations were in place. Then Liz spotted it. Her head snapped to the side and she alerted the others instantly. The ghoul had appeared. It came crashing through an alley, guttural snarls erupting from its throat as it tore through anything in its path. Glenn stepped forward without hesitation. The vice captain told the others to fall back and leave this to him. He charged at the ghoul with a roar, his blade drawn and ready. The battle was brutal and fast. Glenn traded blows with the creature, each strike testing the limits of what steel could do against hardened, rotting flesh. One of the knights activated their law, shouting the incantation to trigger a magical ability. Pillars of earth erupted from the ground, buying Glenn a moment to reposition. He acknowledged the difficulty of the fight through gritted teeth, but did not back down. The ghoul was relentless. It swung with inhuman force, and the knights who engaged it had to move with everything they had just to stay alive. Blades cut through the air, dodging and countering the creature's attacks in a violent exchange that left no room for hesitation. Glenn held his ground, understanding that his role was not to kill the thing outright. He just needed to slow it down long enough for the plan to work. The call went out to pull back. The team shifted tactics and began drawing the ghoul toward the shed, exactly as they had planned. The creature followed, driven by aggression and the scent of the people it wanted to reach. It lunged through the entrance and into the confined space. Kazami was already in position. He stood at a distance with his bow drawn, the arrow nocked and steady. His arms burned from the tension of holding the draw, but his aim was locked. The ghoul was inside. The trap was set. He pulled back with everything he had and prepared to fire, the next step of their strategy resting on a single, well-placed shot. The shed exploded. Debris flew in every direction as the structure collapsed around the ghoul. Khloe moved before Kazami could react, throwing herself over him and driving them both to the ground. Chunks of wood and stone sailed past them, and Khloe raised her gauntleted hand to deflect a piece that came straight at them, batting it aside with a sharp grunt. The silver armor on her fist absorbed the impact without flinching. When the dust settled, Khloe checked on Kazami immediately, asking if he was hurt. He gave her a grateful smile and thanked her. Nearby, one of the knights activated a law incantation, reinforcing the containment around the ghoul as the next phase began. Then, Liz stepped forward. She announced calmly that it was her turn. She launched herself at the ghoul with terrifying speed, her voice cutting through the chaos as she spoke the incantation. The ice law activated instantly. Frost erupted around the ghoul, locking its limbs, freezing the rotting flesh solid. The creature thrashed for a moment, then went still. Liz did not hesitate. She brought her blade down with precision, and the frozen ghoul shattered under the strike. She said her goodbye to it without emotion. It was over. The group took a moment to catch their breath and assess the damage. Glenn was the first to speak, praising Kazami for the power behind the initial shot and the plan that had held together from start to finish. He noted with relief that the area had been sturdy enough to survive the explosion, which meant the collateral damage was minimal. He asked Kazami what came next in terms of dealing with the ghoul infection. Kazami did not miss a beat. He told them he was going to perform an anatomic pathology examination. He needed to dissect the ghoul's body, examine its organs, muscles, and brain under a microscope, and identify the parasites responsible for the transformation. It was the only way to understand how the infection truly worked and whether it could be stopped. He said it with the same matter-of-fact tone he used for everything, as if cutting open a former human was no different from any other diagnosis. Liz remarked that his taste in hobbies was terrible, but she said it with a smirk, not a complaint, and acknowledged that his methods had worked before. She drew the comparison herself, reminding the others of what he had done with the griffin. That autopsy had solved the oleander mystery and saved the breeders. If Kazami said he needed to open up the ghoul to find answers, no one was going to argue. The group settled into a mix of teasing and planning. Kazami was already thinking ahead, his resolve clear. The ghoul was dead, but the disease was still out there. The real work was just beginning. Kazami hunched over the microscope with Liz and Khloe, watching over his shoulders. He pointed out the basics first. The tiny shapes moving through the blood sample were red blood cells and white blood cells, things no one in this world had ever seen before, but mixed in among them were strange brown shapes that did not belong. Khloe asked if the sample came from someone who had been infected. Kazami confirmed it did. He explained that those brown shapes were the parasites responsible for turning humans into ghouls. They were barely the size of a grain of flour, almost invisible, but they were there. He walked them through the distinction between single-celled organisms and multicellular ones, mentioning helminths as a comparison. The parasites in the sample were multicellular, despite their tiny size, which meant they were more complex and harder to deal with than a simple germ. Liz asked how something that small could cause the kind of damage they had seen. Kazami answered plainly. One parasite was nothing, but when they multiplied, flooding the blood by the thousands, the effect was devastating. They entered the body through wounds, traveled through the bloodstream, and eventually reached the brain. Once they settled there and began reproducing, the infection took hold for good. At that stage, there was almost nothing that could be done. He tried to explain the immune system next, describing how white blood cells acted as the body's defense force, hunting down and destroying invaders. But the explanation went over most of their heads. Liz's expression made it clear she had stopped following several sentences ago. Kazami shifted gears and brought the focus back to what mattered most, finding a way to cure the ghoul disease. The problem, he told them, was that these parasites were clever. They could slip past the body's defenses by exploiting something called the blood-brain barrier, a natural wall that protected the brain, but also kept the immune system from reaching everything inside it. Once the parasites crossed that barrier, they were safe to grow unchecked. He moved to the final piece of the puzzle. The rotting smell that ghouls carried was not random. It served a purpose. The decay attracted scavengers, flies, vultures, anything that fed on dead flesh. When those creatures consumed infected tissue, they became new carriers, spreading the parasite further through the food chain. It was a cycle, designed not by intelligence, but by the cold logic of survival. Khloe stared at him with wide, shining eyes, deeply moved by how much he understood about a disease that had terrified this world for generations. She did not grasp every detail, but she recognized the magnitude of what he was doing. Liz, on the other hand, muttered that the time spent on theory would be better used developing an actual cure. Kazami did not disagree, but he made one last point before closing the microscope. Decay and infection were not simply evil. They had a role in nature, a function within the larger ecosystem. Understanding that was not a distraction. It was the foundation on which any real solution would have to be built. Kazami was still going. He spoke with genuine passion about how every living thing operated under nature's rules, how even the ugliest processes served a purpose. His eyes were bright, with the kind of fire that only came from someone who truly loved what they studied. Nora cut him off with a flat look, her rabbit ears twitching as she asked him point blank when he was going to start actually making a cure. Kazami's enthusiasm died mid-sentence, and he stood there, flustered and speechless. He caught himself and admitted he had gotten carried away. He told them to forget the lecture. The priority was creating a medicine that could fight the ghoul infection. Khloe looked at him with wide eyes, amazed at how quickly he shifted from theory to action. He told her everything was ready to begin. What followed was a brief misunderstanding that nearly derailed the conversation. Khloe thought Kazami was referring to something miraculous hidden on her person. Kazami turned red and quickly corrected her. What he actually meant was creating antibodies, training living organisms to produce defenses against the ghoul parasite from within. It was a vaccine concept, something this world had never seen. Nora let out a breath of relief, finally understanding what he was getting at. Kazami shifted gears and asked Khloe directly for her help. The children who had been bitten in the slums still needed treatment, and her healing law was the best tool they had for closing those wounds before the parasites could take hold. Khloe agreed without hesitation, her face brightening with purpose. Meanwhile, Liz was lounging nearby, clearly uninterested in joining the effort. She eventually dragged herself up and tagged along, though her reluctance was obvious. Kazami and Khloe headed out without waiting for Liz to fully commit. As they walked, Kazami mentioned that he had asked Nora earlier to find a cow showing symptoms of the parasitic infection. Nora had already delivered. The animal was waiting for them. The mood was focused, the weight of what came next hanging in the air. Along the way, they discussed broader strategy. Someone suggested isolating the slum's residents to prevent the infection from spreading further, and Kazami agreed. He emphasized the need for extreme caution. Every contact with contaminated material was a risk. He shared his thinking on the source. The dormant Hydra that had been defeated over a century ago was the obvious suspect, but Kazami was not convinced. It had been there for a long time without causing this kind of outbreak. Something else had changed recently. He proposed reinvestigating the backgrounds of the infected to find the real trigger. His theory sharpened as they talked. Someone must have come into contact with ghoul blood in the Hydra's old cave, disturbing something that had been sealed away. He noted how difficult it was to encounter ghoul blood under normal circumstances, which meant this was not accidental. He suggested consulting Liz and Kreese for a deeper investigation into the cave. Outside, they met Nora, who flapped her ears excitedly when she saw Kazami. He thanked her for the hard work. She told him she was relieved to hear the illness was tied more to parasites and magic than some unknown, untreatable plague. She led him eagerly to the cow she had found. Kazami stood before the animal and examined its condition. The parasites were there. The cow was infected. He explained to the others that they could use it to create a vaccine, drawing antibodies from the animal's immune response and using them to protect the slum residents. But it meant the cow would have to be sacrificed. Khloe went quiet, the moral weight of the decision pressing against her. She challenged him softly, questioning whether it was right. Kazami met her eyes and answered calmly. Saving dozens of lives justified the loss of one animal. It was a hard truth, but it was one he had faced many times as a veterinarian, and he did not look away from it. Khloe looked at Kazami for a long moment, then accepted it. She told him she understood and that she would support him no matter how difficult the path was. Her voice was steady. Whatever reservations she had made her choice. Kazami moved quickly after that. He laid out his plan in full, explaining each step as though he were back in a university lecture hall. The infected cow would be injected with a concentrated dose of the ghoul pathogen. Its immune system would respond by producing powerful antibodies. From there, he would use Khloe's healing law to target the cow's spleen, where those antibodies were being generated in large numbers. He walked them through the process of isolating cells, combining them, and growing them on a dish to mass-produce antibodies at scale. It was a technique that had been proven in his world, a method for creating what he called monoclonal antibodies. If everything worked, they would have a vaccine capable of stopping the ghoul infection from spreading further. The others listened with a mix of awe and confusion. Khloe's eyes shone with determination. She did not understand every detail, but she understood enough to know that this was something no one in this world had ever attempted. Someone nearby seemed startled at the possibility that they might actually succeed in saving lives on this scale. Kazami told them all that the outcome depended on combining their abilities. His knowledge alone was not enough. He needed Khloe's law, the knight's discipline, and everyone working together. The team set up a makeshift laboratory and began the procedure. Kazami directed the use of electrical current to fuse the cells, a delicate step that required precision and timing. The predicted result was a stable line of antibody-producing cells that could be harvested and turned into a preventive treatment. He stressed the urgency. Every day they waited was another day the infection could spread. The group voiced their commitment one by one, the energy in the room rising as the work began. Later, in the slums, the quarantine zone people talked in low voices about the harsh measures they had always expected: burning, execution, the usual response to ghoul outbreaks. But today was different. Word spread that someone had been released from the restricted area, cleared of infection. The news sent a ripple through the crowd. People gathered, disbelief mixing with cautious hope. If one person could be freed, maybe others could too. Kazami arrived with his group and addressed the crowd directly. He explained that he could perform blood tests to determine who was clear of the parasite and who still needed monitoring. The process would be fair and transparent. No one would be condemned without evidence. He told them to spread the word so that everyone in the affected area understood how it worked. The tension in the crowd did not vanish, but it shifted. Fear gave way to something closer to trust, fragile and uncertain, but present for the first time since the outbreak began. Someone asked Kazami if things were going to be all right. He smiled and told them the vaccine production was moving forward. As long as the infection did not spread further, they could keep it under control. His confidence was quiet, but real. A few days passed, and the city changed around him. Rumors about Kazami, the black-haired knight, and Liz had spread through Hydra like wildfire. People talked about what he had done in the slums, the ghoul he had taken down, the people he had cleared of infection. His name was on everyone's lips. When he walked through the streets, a crowd gathered, and someone called out for everyone to listen. The response response was immediate and unified. These were people who had started to believe. Kazami remarked to his companion that things were about to get busy. They agreed, and the group pressed forward with renewed energy. But the attention was not all positive. On the streets, townspeople whispered about his feats. They said he had healed people who should have been left for dead and killed a ghoul with a single arrow. The stories grew with each retelling. Some looked at him with awe. Others looked at him with suspicion, wondering how one man could do so much. Kazami caught the stares and felt the unease settle in. He asked aloud if they had done something to draw that kind of attention. Khloe, wide-eyed and indignant, insisted they had not. She could not fathom why anyone would doubt him. When they returned, Kazami was welcomed warmly, thanked for his work. Khloe grabbed someone who had expressed doubt about him and shook them, declaring with fierce intensity that Kazami was not suspicious in the slightest. Her loyalty was as unwavering as ever. Then a message arrived from Liz. Her investigation had narrowed down the likely source of the infection, and she wanted Kazami to see what they had found. He agreed immediately, eager to push forward. Inside the barracks reference room, Kazami and Khloe were met with stacks of documents. The investigation into the infection's origin had uncovered more than they expected. A man briefed them on findings related to microorganisms and patterns in the data that pointed towards something deeper. He brought up a man named Joseph, a former slum dweller who had recently come into money. Joseph had gone from homelessness to a comfortable life almost overnight, and the timing lined up with the start of the ghoul outbreaks. The trail led to a sword, an old weapon that Joseph had recovered from somewhere connected to the Hydra's cave. He had been dealing in relics pulled from that underground space, and his business dealings had linked him to others in the slums. Documents showed that the infected individuals had all come into contact with goods that had passed through cave routes tied to the Hydra's ancient lair. The group debated the possibilities. Could the Hydra's blood be the source of the parasites? Was necromancy involved? Kazami weighed each theory against the evidence, his expression shifting between thought and surprise as new details surfaced. The investigation was layering complexity on top of complexity, and every answer seemed to open two more questions. Then, someone raised the idea that the Hydra itself might still be alive. The room went still. Kazami considered it carefully. Khloe, on the other hand, lit up. Her eyes sparkled with the kind of excitement that only came when she imagined Kazami stepping into a legend. She saw the hero story unfolding in front of her, the Marabito who would slay the ancient beast and save the people. Kazami looked at her and shook his head slightly. He was no hero from the old tales. He was just a veterinarian, an ordinary man from an ordinary world, but the look in Khloe's eyes told him she would never see it that way. Kazami admitted what everyone was thinking. For someone with no special powers, taking on a Hydra sounded impossible. He was not a warrior. He was not a mage. He was a veterinarian who had stumbled into a world that expected heroes, and he had nothing to offer in a straight fight. Khloe told him it was all right. They had handled everything so far as a team, and this would be no different. The conversation shifted to what needed to happen next. The Hydra's cave had to be disinfected. If the parasites were breeding in that environment, leaving it untouched meant the ghoul infection would keep coming back, no matter how many vaccines they produced. Kazami told them he had to go with them personally, because he was the only one who understood the disinfection process. Khloe was taken aback by how serious his tone had become. He told her he wanted them to communicate better going forward, to stop holding things back. The logistics came together quickly. Kazami insisted on proper protection. Everyone would wear masks. No one was to touch anything inside the cave without gloves. The rules for interacting with ghoul-contaminated material stayed the same regardless of the situation. Glenn asked whether a full escort was necessary, and Kazami told him the guidelines did not change just because they were going underground. There was also the possibility that the sewer system and the cave were connected, which meant they could not afford to move slowly. Every hour of delay was a risk. At the entrance to the underground waterway, the group assembled. Everyone had their masks on, their equipment checked. Khloe commented on how ready Kazami looked, and he responded with a grin, clearly in his element. He took a moment to explain his outfit to the others. The jumpsuit, what he called a tsunagi, was the strongest piece of equipment he had. It connected the jacket and pants into a single unit, making it anti-static, antibacterial, odor-resistant, flame-retardant, and water-repellent. It was tough, hard to tear, covered in pockets, and easy to move in. He described it with the pride of someone who genuinely loved practical workwear. The others stared at him blankly, but Kazami did not care. He had also brought a heavy bag of lime powder. Nora's eyes widened when she felt the weight of it, but Kazami explained its purpose. The lime would be spread as they advanced, disinfecting every surface they passed over. If ghoul pathogens survived in carcasses or animal droppings inside the cave, leaving them untreated would create new infections. The powder was their first line of defense. He laid out the formation. Liz would take point with Glenn, clearing the path ahead. Kazami would stay in the center, distributing the lime. Khloe would cover the rear. It was a tight, strategic arrangement designed to keep the group safe while they worked their way deeper into the cave. They stood at the entrance and looked into the darkness. The air coming from below was cold and stale. Kazami tightened his grip on the bag and told them it was time. The group moved forward together, stepping into the ancient cave with the knowledge that whatever they found inside would determine whether the ghoul outbreak ended here or continued to spread. Inside the cave, the space opened up wider than the narrow entrance had suggested. The advance team was already in position. Nora, with her rabbit ears alert and twitching, stood beside Rai, a young knight with cat ears, both using their heightened senses to scan for threats. Kazami approached them with his mask on and asked if they had found anything unusual. They reported only small creatures so far: rats, bats, and slimes, nothing larger. Kazami let out a breath of relief. No Hydra, at least not yet. Glenn noted that having Kazami with them was a kind of safety net. With Khloe's healing abilities in the group, anyone who got hurt had a real chance of recovery. Kazami could not help himself. He looked at the team around him and mentally assigned them roles like characters in an online game. Nora was the hunter, sharp-sensed and fast. Rai was the thief, light on his feet and built for scouting. Glenn was the tank, a knight built for defense and holding the line. Liz was technically a knight too, but her real skills made her more of an assassin, quick and lethal when it counted. Khloe was listed as a priest, but Kazami had seen enough to know she was more of a punching priest, the kind who wore gauntlets and hit things harder than most warriors. She caught him looking and responded with a confident glance. He smiled behind his mask. The party was strange, but it worked. They descended deeper. The hole dropped at least 10 meters, and Kazami remarked under his breath that a fall from that height would kill him. Nora and Rai volunteered to go down first, dropping a rope for the others to follow. The cave below was dark and damp, lit only by the torches they carried. The presence of weak creatures was confirmed almost immediately: slimes, bats, and the occasional rat. Liz assured the group with quiet confidence that nothing down here posed a serious threat on its own. Then they came across a slime, and Kazami paused. He wondered how someone could have been infected by something so weak. The answer came to him quickly. Slimes were scavengers. If one had consumed the carcass of a ghoul-infected bat, the parasites would survive inside its mucus. Anyone who came into contact with that mucus could be infected without ever encountering an actual ghoul. It was indirect transmission, and it was exactly the kind of thing that made disease outbreaks so hard to trace. Glenn moved first. He dispatched the slime with a single thrown stone, hitting its core dead center. The creature burst apart, splattering mucus across the ground. Kazami immediately told the group to switch to ranged attacks from that point forward. Direct contact with slime remains was too risky. Once the area was clear, he spread lime over everything, disinfecting the ground and the splatter before they moved on. They pushed deeper until they hit what appeared to be a dead end. Kazami and the others stood there, confused. There was no smell, no sound, nothing to suggest the cave continued. He frowned, reassessing what they knew. If the threat had been down here, there should have been more evidence. The group considered the implications. Either the source of the infection was not where they expected, or there was something about this dead end they were not seeing yet. The group stood at the dead end and tried to make sense of it. There was no sword, no relic, nothing to explain how Joseph had pulled artifacts from this cave. Someone suggested that the underground waterway might have partially collapsed at some point, making alternative routes unlikely. The structural instability of the cave itself ruled out most detours. Kazami decided to set the sword mystery aside for now and focus on what they could control. The immediate priority was clearing the area of pests and disinfecting everything. Rats, slimes, anything that could carry the parasite had to be dealt with before they left. He mentioned scattering slaked lime as a temporary measure to sterilize the space. Khloe jumped at the opportunity. She grabbed the lime bag with both hands and declared she would handle the dirty work herself. Before anyone could stop her, she was hurling the powder across the cave with far more enthusiasm than the situation required. A thick white cloud erupted around them, and the group started coughing, eyes watering, masks barely holding up against the dust. Then, Kazami noticed something. Through the haze, He felt air moving. It was not coming from behind them. It was flowing from a specific direction, from the rock wall at the dead end. He called out to the others and pointed at the source. Liz moved to the wall and examined it. She activated her law, and the rocks shifted under the force of her magic, crumbling apart to reveal a narrow passage hidden behind them. The dead end was not a dead end at all. They pushed through the opening and found themselves in a hidden chamber. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of excitement. If a passage this well concealed existed, there might be something valuable inside. But the chamber held nothing but rusted weapons and old junk, no treasure, just the forgotten remains of a time no one remembered. The group pressed on, and the cave opened into something far larger than anything they had seen so far. An enormous underground lake stretched out before them, its surface still and dark, illuminated by faintly glowing moss clinging to the cavern walls. And there, resting in the water among countless broken swords embedded in the lake floor, was the Hydra. The creature was massive. Its serpentine body coiled through the shallows, and its scales were riddled with old weapons lodged deep from battles long past. Its eye sockets were hollow. Its flesh was decomposed in places. The group froze. Fear hit them all at once, sharp and cold. Kazami confirmed it for the others. That was not a snake. It was a Hydra, a dragon species known for its water and poison abilities. But something was wrong with it. The creature did not attack. It barely moved. Kazami studied it and began piecing together what had happened. The Hydra was starving. Its body had been consuming itself to stay alive, a process he recognized as autophagy. It had been trapped down here for over a century, ever since Dhoni's ancestor had poured oil into the cave and set it ablaze. The fire had not killed it, but the smoke and toxic fumes had damaged its senses and sealed off its escape. It had been rotting in place ever since, too weak to leave, but too resilient to die. The group discussed the theories quietly, each one adding a detail that made the picture grimmer. The Hydra was a ruin of what it had once been, but even in this state, none of them were ready to turn their backs on it. Kazami stared at the Hydra and weighed his options. Even in its weakened state, getting close was dangerous. The creature still had its water and poison abilities, and anyone who approached risked triggering a reaction. Khloe asked him directly how they should handle it. Kazami admitted he wanted to deal with it here and now. This thing was the source of the ghoul infection, and leaving it alive meant the problem would never truly end. His mind drifted into familiar territory. He thought about it the way he would think about a boss fight in a game. Health bars, attack patterns, damage thresholds. The comparison was absurd given the situation, but it helped him focus. If this were a game, the answer would be simple. You did not fight the boss fair if you did not have to. You used the environment. You set a trap. Then it clicked. His eyes lit up and the words came out before he could second guess them. He told the group he wanted to blow it up, bury it under the cave ceiling, a controlled collapse that would crush the Hydra without anyone having to get within range of its attacks. The silence that followed was deafening. Every face in the group turned to him with the same expression of stunned disbelief. He pressed his case. It was less dangerous than trying to fight it with swords, and far more practical. One of them asked if causing a cave-in was even possible from this distance. The cave was enormous, and the Hydra was far from where they stood. Liz spoke up. She said it could be done, but it would require a boost. A large-scale law spell needed more power than what she could normally generate at range. She would need to use her own blood as a catalyst. Before Kazami could respond, Liz drew a blade and cut into her own arm without flinching. Blood spilled onto a cloth that Glenn had ready. Kazami shouted at her, demanding to know what she was doing. Liz looked at him with her usual flat calm and told him she was providing what was needed. If he wanted the cave-in, this was how it was done. Kazami sputtered that he had only asked whether it was possible, not ordered her to do it. Liz did not seem to care about the distinction. Kazami turned to Khloe and asked her to heal the wound immediately. Khloe hesitated for a moment, still processing the shock of what Liz had just done, but Kazami's steady voice brought her back. She activated her healing law and closed the cut quickly. Kazami thanked her for the speed. He turned back to Liz and told her firmly that in the future, she needed to explain what she was planning before she acted. Significant decisions required communication. Liz shrugged and laid out the reasoning. A law user's blood could amplify the reach and scale of a spell, acting as a booster that extended the effect far beyond its normal range. For something this large, there was no other way. Khloe confirmed she understood the principle, recognizing it as an established combat technique. Kazami took a breath and accepted the situation. He acknowledged that he was still learning how this world worked and that he could not predict everything, but the plan was sound. He tied the blood-soaked cloth to an arrow, drew his bow, and took aim at the ceiling directly above the Hydra. His arms burned from the weight of the draw, but his focus was absolute. He gave the command and released the arrow, sending it arcing upward into the darkness above the ancient beast. The arrow struck the ceiling. Liz activated the law instantly. The incantation left her lips, and the cave above the Hydra split apart. Tons of rock and earth came crashing down, burying the ancient creature under a mountain of rubble. The sound was deafening. The ground shook beneath their feet, and dust billowed outward in a choking wave. When the trembling stopped, the group stood at the edge of the collapse zone and assessed the damage. Someone voiced doubt about whether the structure around them would hold. Kazami looked at the result and told them it had gone according to plan. The ceiling had buckled into a bowl shape directly over the Hydra, and the surrounding cave appeared stable. Nora listened carefully, her ears twitching as she scanned for any sign of further collapse. She confirmed there was no movement, no cracking, no threat of a secondary cave-in. They were safe for now. Someone asked whether Kazami planned to dissect the Hydra next. The group agreed that the creature, trapped and crushed under the rubble, would not survive long. They decided to leave the burial as it was and focus on checking the undamaged side of the cave for any other exits or threats. But the noise they had made had not gone unnoticed. Skeletons began to emerge from the shadows. They crawled out of the rubble and the dark corners of the cavern, armed with rusted weapons, their hollow skulls glowing faintly. Kazami's stomach dropped the moment he saw them. More and more appeared, over 20 in total, forming a wall of bone and steel between the group and the way out. He muttered under his breath, frustrated that the situation had escalated again. Liz told him they could not afford to retreat. Turning their backs on this many skeletons was an invitation to be cut down from behind. The only option was to fight through them. The group readied themselves, shifting into a defensive formation. If they held their ground and picked the skeletons apart, they could manage. Then, a sound cut through the cavern that froze everyone in place. A low, deep pulse of energy, followed by a glow. Kazami's eyes locked onto the rubble pile. Dark purple light was bleeding through the gaps between the rocks. The Hydra was still alive. He screamed for everyone to get down. Liz reacted in the same instant, throwing up a rock wall with her law as fast as she could. The incantation ripped from her throat, and stone erupted from the ground to form a barrier between the group and the Hydra's attack. The blast hit the wall and shattered it. The purple light tore through the rock and struck beyond. One moment, Nora was there. The next, she was gone. The attack had hit her directly, and what remained was something Kazami could not bring himself to look at. The cavern went silent, except for the sound of rubble settling. Kazami stood frozen, his body locked, his mind refusing to process what had just happened. Nora had been laughing and talking minutes ago. Now she was dead. The blast had carved a crater into the ground where Nora had stood. Kazami stared at it, his body rigid, his mind screaming at him to move, but unable to send the signal. Someone called his name. Glenn was shouting for him, trying to pull him back to the present. The force of the Hydra's attack had sent debris and dark splatters across the cavern. Kazami felt something wet on his face, but could not bring himself to wipe it away. The Hydra shifted beneath the rubble. Through the broken stone, its remaining eye glowed faintly, alive and watching. Khloe stood nearby, her hands pressed together, her body trembling, but her composure holding. She analyzed the attack through shallow breaths and told the others it had not been a breath weapon. It was a poison attribute law, a magical assault with amplified power that none of them had expected from a creature in this state. Even buried and half dead, the Hydra's law was devastating. Liz took control of the situation immediately. She laid out a plan. Glenn and Rye would handle the skeletons. She would provide support and try to keep the Hydra occupied. Khloe would get Kazami out of the cave. It was a retreat strategy, built on the assumption that protecting Kazami was the priority, and that some of them might not make it out. Kazami heard the plan and felt the words land like a punch. If the Hydra fired again, the people staying behind would have no protection. He asked Liz directly what they would do if another blast came. She answered without hesitation. They would deal with it, and if they could not deal with it, they would die. That was the reality. Something broke inside Kazami at that moment, not in a way that made him weaker, in a way that made him angry. The image of Nora flashed through his mind, her laughter, her rabbit ears flapping when she was excited, the way she had stood beside him through every step of the investigation. She was dead because he had made the call to enter this cave. That weight was his to carry, and he refused to add anyone else's name to the list. He told Liz he was not leaving. He told all of them he could not accept a plan that meant sacrificing the people who had trusted him. If he ran now and let them die, then every word he had spoken about saving lives was meaningless. He could not call himself the eminence of this world, could not stand beside Khloe and the others with a clear conscience if he turned his back on them in the moment that mattered most. "I will not serve as the Jui-sama of this world if I leave my friends to die," he said, his voice cracking but certain. It was the first time he had spoken those words out loud, and they carried the weight of everything he had lost and everything he was determined to protect. The silence that followed Kazami's declaration was heavy. He had drawn a line, and now he had to stand on it. Liz studied him with her flat, unreadable expression and asked him plainly whether he understood what he was asking. If they stayed and fought, the outcome rested entirely on his shoulders. She told him she would not interfere with his decision, but she would not pretend it was rational either. If he gave the order, she would follow it, and if his judgment got them killed, that was a consequence he would have to own. Kazami felt the weight of it settle on him, and for a moment, doubt crept in. He almost wished someone had stopped him from challenging the Hydra in the first place, but that thought passed quickly. He was here, and there was no going back. The conversation shifted as the group assessed what they actually had to work with. Liz pointed out that under normal circumstances, any sane person would run from a dragon. That was not cowardice, it was survival instinct. But Kazami was not a normal person. He was a Marabito, someone from another world, and that came with traits no one in this world fully understood. Khloe confirmed what they had all noticed. The Hydra's law attack had not targeted Kazami directly. Even the skeletons, which should have been hostile, showed less aggression toward him than toward the others. Whatever made him different, it might be the one advantage they had. Kazami turned that realization over in his mind. If the Hydra's law could not lock onto him, then he was the only one who could get close without being obliterated. The creature was blind, and its senses were ruined, which meant it relied on its law to detect and destroy threats. A person it could not detect was a person it could not kill. Liz laid out the cost. If Kazami went in alone, the rest of them would serve as decoys, drawing the skeletons away and keeping the Hydra's attention divided. She did not dress it up. They were expendable in her eyes, and she said so without flinching. The risk was real for all of them. Kazami made his decision. He told them he was going. He asked Khloe about the stories she had told him, the tales of past Marabito who had ridden dragons and built nations. If those legends were real, then what he was about to do was not impossible. It was just terrifying. He instructed Khloe to prepare the arrows, enhancing them for what lay ahead. The desperation in the plan was obvious, but no one argued. This was their only shot. The team rallied around him. Glenn promised to clear a path through the skeletons. Liz would use her earth magic to build a route to the Hydra. Khloe and the others would hold the line behind him. They each offered their support with a solemnity that told Kazami they understood the stakes. He looked toward the Hydra, roughly 50 meters away, with a wall of armed skeletons standing between them. The odds were absurd. 6 people against over 20 skeletons, and a dragon that could kill with a single blast. But Kazami had made a promise. He was going to prove that an ordinary veterinarian from another world could do what legends said only heroes could. He gripped his weapon, took a breath, and prepared to charge. Kazami ran. He shouted to Liz for a footing, and she responded instantly. Earth erupted beneath his feet, forming a raised path that launched him forward over the first wave of skeletons. Liz's magic propelled him with violent speed, her focus locked on keeping the terrain ahead of him as he sprinted toward the Hydra. The creature sensed the movement. Its remaining head lunged from the rubble, jaws wide, the stench of decay and poison rolling off it in waves. Kazami dodged hard to the side, leaping over a chunk of falling stone as the Hydra's body crashed through the space he had just occupied. His heart hammered in his chest, but his legs kept moving. He told himself he would not get hit. He repeated it like a mantra, forcing his body to obey, even as fear screamed at him to stop. He stumbled. The impact jolted through his knees and up his spine, but he threw himself back onto his feet before the next attack could find him. He called out to Liz again, asking for another platform. The earth shifted, and a new foothold rose just in time for him to push off toward the Hydra's exposed flank. Kazami drew his bow mid-run. His hands shook, but his eyes locked onto the targets. The Hydra's law attacks flared around him, purple light streaking past, but none of them locked on. He was invisible to it. He knocked arrow after arrow and fired in rapid succession, each shot aimed at the weak points in the creature's ruined scales. The shafts flew true. Every one of them hit. He allowed himself a single breath of triumph as the last arrow struck home. Khloe's voice cut through the chaos behind him, begging him to pull back. Kazami told her not to worry. He was not done yet. He closed the remaining distance and drove his knife into the Hydra's eye. The blade sank deep, and he twisted it, widening the wound. The creature thrashed, but it was too weak and too blind to shake him off. Kazami planted his safety boot against the handle and kicked with everything he had, driving the blade through the eye socket and into the brain behind it. The Hydra's body convulsed once, violently, and then went still. Behind him, Liz's voice rang out. She chanted the incantation, her law activating one final time. The magic surged through the Hydra's body, accelerating the decay and calcification until the creature's flesh hardened into something resembling petrified wood. The purple lights that had terrorized them flickered and died. The skeletons collapsed where they stood, their animating force gone. The cavern fell silent. Kazami hung from the side of the Hydra's transformed body, his arms trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked around at the still, quiet cave. The skeletons were down. The Hydra was dead, truly dead this time. Exhaustion and relief hit him at the same moment, and for a few seconds, he could do nothing but hold on and stare at the world he had just saved a small piece of. Before they left the cave, Kazami stood at the place where Nora had died. There was no body to bury, but he made a grave anyway. He stood beside it with his hands pressed together, head bowed, silent. Liz and Khloe watched from a distance, neither saying a word. The cavern was quiet now, the petrified remains of the Hydra looming behind him like a monument to what it had cost them to get here. Kazami turned away from the grave and looked at the Hydra's corpse. He noted it was truly dead, but the confirmation brought no satisfaction. Then Khloe's voice broke through the stillness. She called his name and ran toward him, her worry spilling over before she even reached him. She asked if he was hurt, her face caught between relief that he was standing and fear that something was wrong. Kazami steadied her and told her to check on the others first. Glenn and Rai were still clearing the last of the skeletons, and their safety mattered more than his right now. The remaining skeletons were falling apart on their own. Without the Hydra's law to animate them, they were nothing but bones and rusted metal. Glenn and Rai finished them off without difficulty, and one of them remarked that these things were hardly worth the effort now that the source was gone. The threat was over. Someone mentioned the legend, Kazami's ability to approach the Hydra without being targeted by its law. The fact that its magic had passed right through him, that was not normal. It was the kind of thing the old stories talked about when they described past Marabito. The immunity, the resistance to the world's magic. Kazami heard it and felt nothing close to pride. He told them quietly that if he could have chosen any power, it would have been the ability to turn back time. He would have used it to save Nora. No one argued with him. Even with only 6 of them left, they were alive, and that had to be enough. Then, Kazami touched his forehead and felt something wet. He pulled his hand back and saw dark liquid on his fingers. His stomach dropped. He looked at his gloves and found the same. The Hydra's blood. It was on him. Someone reminded him what that meant. Hydra blood was one of the most lethal poisons in this world. Contact with the skin could kill over a period of days, and in the worst case, it triggered a transformation into a ghoul. The very thing he had spent weeks fighting to cure was now inside him. Kazami stood still for a moment, processing it. He wondered if this was the price for his decisions, for the choices he had made that led to Nora's death, and everything that followed. The guilt and the poison felt like the same thing. Khloe's composure cracked. She told him they needed to get back to the castle immediately. Her voice was tight with barely controlled panic. The group moved fast. At Dhoni's castle, doctors were already waiting in the medical room. Someone asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Had the eminence truly been exposed to Hydra blood? The answer was yes, and the room went tense. They began examining him, searching for the symptoms that should have already started. The deadly potential of the poison hung over everything, and for the first time since he had arrived in this world, Kazami was not the one providing answers. He was the patient. The doctor laid out what should have happened. Hydra blood on the skin meant death within days. Ingestion meant death within a single day. And in many cases, the poison triggered a transformation into a ghoul before the end came. Kazami listened and acknowledged the timeline. Enough time had passed since his exposure that the symptoms should have appeared by now. They had not. He told them he believed his origin from another world might explain it. His body lacked whatever properties the poison needed to take hold. It was a theory, not a certainty, but it was the only explanation that fit. He proposed a plan. He would spend the next period in a quarantine room under observation, proving through his own body that the anti-ghoulification medicine worked and that the Hydra's blood had no hold on him. It was a risk he was willing to take. He told the others not to worry too much, though the reflection in his eyes suggested he was carrying more than he let on. Later, outside the castle walls, Kazami stood at a grave with Liz and Khloe beside him. The remains of the person buried there had once been human. Now there was only ash. The Hydra's attack had left nothing recognizable. Kazami looked at the small mound of earth and felt the full weight of what he had failed to protect. Nora had trusted him. She had followed him into that cave, and she had not come out. Liz and Khloe watched him from a step behind, concern plain on their faces. One of them quietly asked the other whether he was crying. The answer was not clear, but the question itself spoke to the kind of man Kazami was. He felt things deeply, even when the world demanded he be harder. His companions saw his naivety as a flaw and a strength at the same time. His dreams were impractical. His faith in saving everyone was unrealistic. And yet those were the very things that made people follow him. Kazami knelt at the graveside and let his thoughts settle. He thought about action and faith, about what it meant to do everything you could and still lose someone. Khloe moved closer and told him she would stay beside him for as long as he needed her. Liz, in her own way, affirmed the same. Her commitment came out as duty rather than sentiment, but the meaning was no different. The rain started. Kazami looked up and realized it was the wrong kind of weather for standing over a grave with someone who had sensitive ears. Liz caught the shift in his attention and teased him, asking if he had been crying earlier. He denied it and told her firmly that when someone was gone, the only thing left to do was face it and move forward. Dwelling served no one. Liz seemed to respect that answer, even if she did not say so directly. The mood lightened in small degrees. They traded words that were half serious and half playful, the kind of exchange that only happened between people who had been through something terrible together and survived. Liz told Kazami she was impressed by him, not because of the Hydra or the ghoul investigation, but because of the quiet, stubborn way he kept going when everything told him to stop. Kazami brushed the praise off, embarrassed by it, insisting there was nothing impressive about stubbornness. Liz laughed at that, a short, genuine sound that cut through the rain and the grief and the exhaustion. Khloe joined in, and for a moment, standing in the rain beside a grave, the three of them found something that felt almost like warmth. It was not happiness, it was not resolution, but it was enough to take the next step forward. Khloe spoke first. She told Kazami that she wanted to help as much as she could, for as far as her reach would carry her. There was no hesitation in her voice. Whatever came next, she was in. Kazami nodded and told them both what had been turning over in his mind. Nora's death had changed something in him. It had forced him to confront the weight of a single life in a way that theory and medicine never could. He said it plainly. This incident had made him rethink everything. He laid out his plan. He wanted to collect funds and invest them in improving the territory's medical care and agricultural technology. He was not going to pretend he was something he was not. Unlike the Marabito who had come before him, he could not build nations or ride dragons into battle. He was a veterinarian, and his tools were knowledge, prevention, and the stubborn refusal to accept suffering as inevitable. He told them that his ideology, his way of doing things in this world, was just beginning. He looked at Khloe and Liz and asked them to stay with him, not as servants or subordinates, as partners in what was going to be a long, difficult road. Khloe answered immediately, her eyes bright and her voice full. She told him that of course she would. There was no question. Liz took a moment longer, then smiled in that quiet, unreadable way of hers. She told him that if it was her master's wish, she would obey. The playfulness in her tone did not hide the sincerity underneath. Back at Dhoni's castle, Kazami settled into the isolation room. The quarantine was necessary, 10 days of observation to confirm that the Hydra's blood had no hold on him. He sat at a desk with the furball rabbit perched nearby, turning over his notes and thinking about what came next. He told himself he was done sitting still. Even confined to a tower, there was work to be done, plans to draft, knowledge to compile. Every hour mattered. The quiet was broken when a guard appeared at the door, his voice urgent. Kazami looked up, surprised by the sudden interruption. The guard told him that Glenn was here and needed his help. He was asking Kazami to protect the leader. Before Kazami could ask what had happened, Liz walked through the door. She was upright, but barely. Her face was bruised, her body wrapped in bloody bandages, and every step she took carried the kind of pain that most people would not be able to hide. Kazami's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. He demanded to know what had happened to her, his voice sharp with concern as he moved toward her to assess the damage. The injuries were real, and they were bad. Someone had done this to her deliberately, and Kazami could already feel the anger building alongside the worry. Kazami demanded answers. He asked Liz directly how she had gotten those injuries, his voice tight with a mix of anger and disbelief. Liz stood there, battered and resigned, offering no explanation of her own. Glenn filled in the rest. Kazami was under quarantine because of the risk of ghoulification from the Hydra's blood. That risk had infuriated Lord Dhoni, and Liz had been the one to deliver the report. Dhoni had beaten her for it. She had been held responsible for something none of them could have prevented. Kazami's jaw clenched. They had defeated the Hydra. They had eliminated the source of the ghoul infection. They had done everything that was asked of them and more. And this was the reward. He could barely contain the frustration. Glenn asked Kazami to help. He wanted to hide Liz inside the tower, away from Dhoni's rage. If she went back, there was no telling what the Lord would do next. Kazami hesitated for a moment, weighing the consequences, then agreed. He would not send her back to that. Glenn bowed deeply, his gratitude sincere, and asked that Liz be allowed to stay for as long as it took. Kazami told him she could. With Liz sheltered in the tower, the quarantine settled into a strange kind of stillness. Kazami stood by the window and looked out at the sky. He told Liz that since neither of them had much to do, they might as well wait together. The anti-ghoulification observation period would last 10 days. Until then, they were both stuck. Kazami left the room and climbed the stairs to check on the others. He did not make it far. Quina was waiting on the landing, and the moment she saw him, her entire body tensed with hostility. She accused him of acting too nice, of putting on a kind face that she could not stand to look at. Rai stepped in before the situation could escalate. He explained to Kazami what was driving Quina's anger. She and Nora had been close. Nora's death had torn something open inside her, and Kazami, as the one who had led them into the cave, was the easiest target for that grief. Quina did not hold back. She confronted Kazami with every accusation she had been carrying. She told him he should have done more. He should have saved Nora. She despised his gentleness because it felt like a lie to her, a mask worn by someone who had let the people around him die. Her voice cracked as the pain behind the anger broke through. Rai tried to reason with her. He reminded her that what happened in the cave was not something anyone could have predicted. Chance played its part, and blame did not undo loss. He admitted his own guilt openly, acknowledging that every one of them carried responsibility for what had happened. But he also told Quina that hatred aimed at the wrong person would only make things worse. Kazami said nothing. He stood there and took it. He did not defend himself, did not argue, did not try to explain. He knew Quina was hurting, and he knew that no words from him would fix it. The only thing he could do was carry the weight of her anger alongside his own guilt, and hope that someday the grief would loosen its grip on both of them. Later, after the tension with Quina had cooled, Rai sat with Kazami and spoke quietly about what made him different. He told Kazami that most masters did not care about the lives of their slaves. They used them and discarded them without a second thought. Kazami's concern for every person under his command, slave or not, was something Rai had never seen before. It was the reason the knights followed him, not because of his title, but because he treated them like they mattered. Kazami listened, staring out over the vast landscape below the tower, the weight of leadership pressing down on him from every direction. What Rai did not say was how Liz had ended up in the tower in the first place. That story had played out hours earlier in Dhoni's chambers. Liz and Glenn had knelt before the Lord, their heads bowed. Dhoni sat across from them, a glass of wine in his hand and a smirk on his face. He waved off the formality and told them to get on with it. The report came from Liz, steady and precise. The ghoul epidemic had been traced to a Hydra living beneath the city. Kazami and the knights had descended into the cave and killed the creature. One knight had been lost. The threat was eliminated. Dhoni's reaction was exactly what they expected. He grinned with satisfaction, already calculating how to use the news to boost his reputation. He praised the result, marveling at the fact that His Eminence had managed to subdue something as dangerous as a Hydra. He wanted it publicized immediately. The people needed to hear that their lord had solved the crisis, never mind that he had not set foot anywhere near the cave himself. Liz continued the report without expression. She detailed the measures being taken to prevent further ghoulification and the progress on Kazami's vaccine research. Dhoni poured himself more wine, basking in the success as though it were his own. The stoic delivery from Liz only seemed to amuse him. Then the mood shattered. Liz told Dhoni that Kazami had been exposed to Hydra blood during the battle. The wine glass stopped halfway to Dhoni's mouth. His expression twisted. The satisfaction vanished, replaced by something cold and furious. He demanded to know how this had happened, how Liz, the leader of the slave knights, had allowed the most valuable person in the territory to come into contact with one of the deadliest poisons in existence. Liz told him the examination had revealed no abnormalities. It did not matter. Dhoni's rage had already taken hold. He hurled the wine bottle at her. It struck her across the face, and before she could recover, he was on his feet, kicking her while she knelt on the floor. He called her useless. He called her a failure. He berated her for every coin he had invested in the summoning, for every sacrifice that had been made to bring Kazami into this world, and for the incompetence of letting it all come undone because of a splash of blood. Liz did not fight back. She did not cry out. She took every blow with the same flat expression she wore for everything else, her body absorbing the violence while her face gave nothing away. That only made Dhoni angrier. Glenn watched from the side, his expression heavy with the kind of helplessness that came from knowing he could not intervene. When Dhoni finally exhausted himself, Glenn stepped forward and lied. He told the Lord that a superior had sent word requesting the leader's presence. It was enough to get Dhoni to stop. He set conditions for Liz's survival, threatened Glenn with the same fate if things did not improve, and ordered the Hydra's corpse displayed publicly by morning. Glenn carried Liz out of the room. She could barely walk. Behind the closed door, a young girl who had been forced to witness the entire scene trembled on the floor, too terrified to move. She begged for mercy, but Dhoni was already done listening. Dhoni had barely stopped. Even after Glenn's lie, the Lord dismissed the idea that Kazami could help Liz. He said she was going to die anyway. The Hydra's blood was a death sentence, and no amount of treatment from some outsider was going to change that. His indifference was absolute. Glenn pushed back carefully. He suggested that Kazami had already developed methods to counter ghoulification and might know how to deal with the poison as well. It was a gamble. Glenn was sweating under Dhoni's gaze, the threat of execution hanging over every word he spoke, but it was enough to make the Lord pause. Dhoni gave his orders. The Hydra's corpse was to be burned and displayed publicly. Whatever knowledge Kazami possessed about treating the poison was to be extracted as a precaution, and if no solution was found, Liz and Glenn would both answer for it with their lives. He made that last point with the casual cruelty of a man who had never considered his slaves as anything more than tools. Glenn gathered Liz, and they left the room. The moment the door closed behind them, Liz spoke. She told Glenn she knew he had lied. There had been no call from Kazami, no special summons. Glenn had fabricated it to stop Dhoni from killing her on the spot. Glenn did not deny it. He told her the lie was all he had. Their exchange was blunt and laced with the kind of honesty that only came from people who had nothing left to lose. Liz told him off for putting himself at risk over someone like her. She used the word trash to describe herself, and Glenn pushed back, refusing to let her reduce herself to that. He told her he would only take orders from someone who outranked him, and right now, that was still her. Liz responded with something that might have been a laugh if it had carried any warmth. She reached up and touched Glenn's face, a gesture so unlike her that it stopped him mid-step. She told him quietly that he might not get the chance to follow those orders for long. She would be in a grave before any of it mattered. Glenn did not respond to that. They both understood the conditions Dhoni had set. If Kazami did not survive the Hydra blood, a leadership transition would be forced, and the people standing at the bottom of the hierarchy would be the first to fall. They walked the rest of the way in silence, the weight of what lay ahead too heavy for words. Later that evening, Kazami stood on the tower rooftop and looked out at the darkening sky. The air was cold and still. He thought about Liz, about the injuries she had taken for delivering a simple report, about the world she had survived in for years before he arrived, a world where being beaten for doing your job was not an exception, but a rule. He wondered what she was thinking, wherever she was in the tower below him, whether she saw any of this the way he did, or whether she had stopped seeing anything at all a long time ago. The stars were beginning to appear, and Kazami watched them one by one, each point of light carrying a question he did not yet know how to answer. The evening settled into something almost peaceful. Kazami sat at a table near the window, picking at his food and glancing upward. Liz had been on the rooftop for too long. He set his plate aside and climbed the stairs to find her. She was sitting at the edge, her ears flat, her gaze fixed on the sky. The stars were everywhere, dense and brilliant in a way Kazami had never seen back home. He asked her if she was cold. She told him she was fine, her answer short and distant. He sat down nearby and looked up with her. The sky was stunning. He told her that where he came from, you could barely see the stars at all. Pollution had blotted most of them out. The cities glowed too bright, and the air was too thick. Liz turned that over for a moment. She told him that fewer stars was a good thing. In this world, each star was said to represent the soul of someone who had died. A sky packed with light meant a world packed with death. Kazami's world, with its dim, polluted heavens, sounded kinder to her. Fewer stars meant fewer lives lost. The thought hit Kazami harder than he expected. He told Liz that he intended to change things here. He was going to save more people than any hero who had come before him. Not with a sword or magic or some legendary power, with knowledge, with prevention, with the stubborn refusal to accept that suffering was just the way things worked. He said it with quiet certainty, and Liz studied his face as though she was trying to decide whether he was serious. He was. Later that night, Kazami fell asleep at his desk while working through his notes. The cold woke him, the room had dropped in temperature, and the fire had died down to embers. He blinked the sleep from his eyes and realized Liz was not inside. He checked the floors below, then the rooms, and found nothing. His pulse quickened. He took the stairs back up to the rooftop and found her slumped against the wall. Her skin was pale. Her lips had lost their color. She was not responsive. He crouched beside her, called her name, and pressed his fingers to her wrist. Her pulse was faint and slow. He pinched the skin on her thigh to test her reaction. Mild hypothermia, possibly moderate. She had been out here in the freezing air for hours without moving. Kazami did not hesitate. He gathered her up and carried her down the stairs, her body limp and cold against his. He brought her to the room, laid her on the bed, and set to work starting a fire. His hands fumbled with the flint, and it took several tries before the sparks caught. He told her under his breath that she was going to explain herself when she woke up. The frustration in his voice could not hide the fear underneath it. He had already lost Nora. He was not going to lose Liz to something as senseless as sitting alone in the cold until her body gave out. The flint refused to cooperate. Kazami struck it against the steel again and again, cursing the absence of anything as simple as a match. Sawdust scattered across the hearth, and sparks flew without catching. It took more attempts than he wanted to count before the fire finally took hold. He exhaled and managed a tired smile. This was his life now. Every fire started from scratch, every day. He moved to the bed and checked on Liz. Her color was slowly coming back. Her breathing had steadied. He watched her closely, and after a while, her eyes opened. She looked around the room, confused, and asked where she was. Then she asked if he needed something from her. Even half-conscious, her mind defaulted to duty. She seemed surprised that he was there at all, that he had gone to the trouble of bringing her inside and warming her up. She was a slave. People did not do this for slaves. Kazami did not respond to the unspoken question. He just told her to rest. But Liz did not rest. She studied him and asked why he did things like this, why he cared about someone like her, someone whose existence was defined entirely by the orders she received. She said it without bitterness, just a flat statement of fact. She was not fishing for sympathy. She genuinely did not understand. The conversation deepened. Liz asked him directly why he was in this world. Kazami paused, caught off guard by the weight of the question. He told her honestly that he did not have a clean answer. He talked about the things that had always driven him: family, work, the connections that made life feel like it had a point. Those were the reasons he kept going. Not destiny or heroism, just the simple, stubborn belief that the people around him were worth fighting for. Liz listened. Then she told him that she had none of those things. No family, no purpose, no reason to keep living that she could name. She said that if she died, no one would be inconvenienced. It was not self-pity. It was the calculation of someone who had weighed her own existence and found it empty. Kazami told her she was wrong. His efforts to keep people alive were not wasted, and that included her. She acknowledged the thought with something close to respect, admitting that his ability to keep going was impressive, even if she could not feel the same way herself. They sat together in the quiet of the room, and at some point, Liz reached out and took his hand. It was a small gesture, barely more than her fingers resting against his, but it carried everything she could not say out loud. Kazami did not pull away. They talked about what it meant to be alive in a world that treated most of its people as disposable, and neither of them had all the answers. But for that moment, the questions felt less crushing when shared. Then the tone shifted. Kazami told Liz that from now on, she was to protect him, faithfully, like a dog guarding its master. The bluntness of it caught her off guard, and for a second, something flickered across her usually blank expression. She recovered quickly. She called him her temporary master and told him she would obey. Then, with the faintest edge of amusement, she let out a quiet bark. Kazami was flustered by the response, caught between embarrassment and the realization that Liz had just made the closest thing to a joke he had ever heard from her. It was absurd and awkward, and exactly the kind of ending their conversation needed. The heaviness did not vanish, but it loosened just enough for both of them to breathe. The arrangement between them solidified in the strangest way possible. Liz told Kazami she would stay loyal and protect him, like a guard dog at his side. Her tail moved behind her as she said it, a small, involuntary wag that betrayed more feeling than her flat tone let on. Kazami, still caught up in the absurdity of it all, insisted that she respond with a proper bark whenever he gave an order. Liz stared at him with a look that sat somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. disbelief. She asked if this was really any different from before. Kazami told her it was. He wanted a Liz who lived with a human heart, not one who followed orders because she had nothing else. Mutual respect, that was the deal. Liz sighed deeply, her expression a tangle of amusement and something she probably would have denied if asked. She told him she would follow his lead. Kazami grinned and told her that having fun was part of the arrangement too. Life was too short and too brutal to waste on misery alone. The exchange went back and forth until both of them settled into something that felt, improbably, comfortable. Liz sat in the room with her tail resting calmly behind her, and when Kazami asked for confirmation, she gave him a quiet double bark and a small smile. He told her the deal was sealed. The warmth between them was real, even if neither of them knew exactly what to call it. Far from the tower, Khloe's days during the isolation period carried a different weight entirely. She woke from nightmares more often than she slept through the night. In her dreams, she would find Kazami resting at his desk, and when she reached out to wake him, his face would twist into something inhuman, a ghoul. The transformation would happen right in front of her, and she would scream herself awake, her heart hammering, her hands shaking. The fear of losing him to the Hydra's poison was a wound that would not close. But when morning came, she pulled herself together. She asked him through a guard if he had rested well, and his response, calm and ordinary, was enough to steady her for the day ahead. She could not be with him inside the tower, so she did the work he could not. She went to the churches and spoke to the people of Hydra directly. She explained the truth about ghouls, about the parasites, about the vaccine and the investigation that had led to the Hydra's death. She corrected the rumors and the fear with facts, delivered in a voice that carried the authority of the Hydra Church and the conviction of someone who had seen it all firsthand. The people listened. Some were skeptical, most were afraid, but Khloe did not waver. She stood before each congregation with the same firm, hopeful expression and told them that the threat could be overcome, that they were not abandoned, that there was someone fighting for them, even now. When the church bells finally rang on the 10th day, signaling the end of Kazami's isolation, the sound carried across the city like a promise. Khloe heard it and felt something inside her break open with relief. The waiting was over. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And Kazami, somewhere in the tower above, heard those same bells and knew it was time to step back into the world he had chosen to save. The steel door at the top of the tower did not stand a chance. Khloe's kick hit it with enough force to send it crashing inward, the hinges screaming in protest. A guard nearby panicked, shouting that Kazami could have been standing behind it. Khloe did not care. Her instinct told her he was not there, and she trusted that instinct completely. She sprinted through the doorway, calling his name, her voice cracking with 10 days of pent-up worry. The scene she found stopped her short. Kazami was on the rooftop, seated in Liz's lap, looking dazed. Liz had her arms around him, her wolf ears twitching, and the whole thing looked far more intimate than either of them probably intended. Khloe's relief twisted into something sharper the moment she processed what she was seeing. Kazami sat up from Liz's lap, wincing from a throbbing pain and rubbing a scratch on his arm. He called out to Khloe, asking what was wrong with Liz's expression. Khloe's eyes locked onto the wound. She offered immediately to heal it with her law, insisting she was more than capable. Kazami waved her off, telling her he was fine. Someone else cut in and pointed out that the whole scene was being blown out of proportion. The scratches were from sword practice. Liz had dragged Kazami into a sparring session out of boredom, and the injuries were nothing serious. The chaos settled, and a man apologized for the disturbance. Practical matters surfaced, conversations about changing bedsheets and sorting out the room after 10 days of occupation. Kazami let those details wash past him. His mind had already moved to what mattered. He sat down with Liz and Khloe and laid out what he had been thinking during the isolation. This world needed more than one man fighting ghouls and slaying hydras. It needed systems, better hygiene, better agriculture, better medicine, the kind of infrastructure that prevented disease instead of scrambling to cure it after the damage was done. He explained that his purpose in being summoned was not to be a hero with a sword. It was to bring the knowledge that could change how this territory functioned at its foundation. Liz asked him the practical question, could he do all of that alone? Kazami admitted he could not. He needed authority, and authority required resources. Funding was the first step. He proposed selling the medicines he had been developing, starting a pharmaceutical operation that would generate revenue and build trust at the same time. If people saw that his treatments worked, his reputation would grow, and with it, the leverage he needed to push for larger changes. The conversation shifted to finances and opportunities. They unrolled a map and began marking potential sites for resource acquisition. The discussion touched on mythical metals, territories controlled by powerful creatures, and the kind of wealth that could fund everything Kazami wanted to build. Someone brought up a dragon's nest as a possible target. The reasoning was counterintuitive. The dragon that guarded the area kept lesser threats away, which meant the surrounding territory was actually safer to operate in than most wild regions. The group weighed the risks against the rewards. Every option came with danger, and every plan required more people, more skills, and more luck than they currently had. Kazami and his companions studied the map and talked through the possibilities, knowing that whatever path they chose would be a gamble. But doing nothing was no longer an option. The veterinarian from another world had made his decision long ago. Now it was time to build something that would last. Someone reminded the group what they were actually talking about. Fighting a dragon was not a battle. It was a natural disaster, the kind of creature that could level a city on its own. Defeating one earned a person the title of legendary, and that title existed for a reason. It was not given out lightly, and the people who held it had either been extraordinarily powerful or extraordinarily lucky. Kazami listened and felt the sweat gather at the back of his neck. The discussion about dragon treasures was thrilling in theory, but the reality of what it took to earn those treasures was something else entirely. Khloe, as always, expressed full confidence in Kazami's abilities. She told him she believed he could do it, her eyes shining with the kind of faith that made him want to shrink rather than stand taller. He asked her where that confidence came from, and she did not have an answer that made the situation any less terrifying. The conversation turned practical. Instead of going directly after a dragon, they could target something lower on the threat scale. Someone unfolded a document about fire rats, creatures that lived in volcanic regions and were far more manageable than a full-grown dragon. The resources they provided were still valuable, and the risk was significantly lower. A fox-eared figure in the room seemed skeptical of the whole enterprise, watching the discussion unfold with guarded interest. Then someone mentioned the dragon's nest out loud, and a voice erupted from the next room in protest. The idea of going anywhere near a dragon's territory set off a passionate objection. The volcanic region was active, crawling with monsters, and guarded by a red dragon that had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Kazami weighed the danger against the potential reward. Red dragons, unlike most of their kind, were known to have some history of interaction with humans. That did not make them safe, but it made them less immediately hostile than a creature that attacked everything on sight. The objections continued, and the room split between those who saw opportunity and those who saw a death sentence. Then an offer was made. One of the figures in the room proposed a deal. They would assist with the fire rat subjugation if Kazami agreed to lend Liz for a separate task. The arrangement benefited both sides. Kazami would get the help he needed for the hunt, and the other party would gain access to Liz's combat skills for their own mission. Kazami considered it carefully. The terms were fair, even if the underlying dynamics were more complicated than a simple trade. The person making the offer maintained a friendly demeanor, but there was a sharpness beneath the surface that told Kazami this was not generosity. It was strategy. He agreed to the terms anyway. The resources they stood to gain were too important to pass up, and Liz could handle herself in any situation. The deal was struck, and the group prepared to move. Kazami left the room with the quiet understanding that every alliance in this world came with strings attached. The tension of unspoken agreements hung in the air as he stepped into the next phase of his journey, knowing that the road ahead would test not just his knowledge, but his ability to navigate the politics and power plays of a world that never stopped demanding more from the people trying to change it. The group set out along a dirt road with Kazami at the front, moving with more energy than anyone expected from a man who had spent the last 10 days in a tower. The baby griffins fluttered alongside him, startling him when one swooped too close and a butterfly landed on its beak. Behind him rode the rest of the party, Liz with her ears flat against the wind, Quina keeping her distance as always, and the others spread out in a loose formation. The road ended abruptly. A landslide had buried the path under a wall of earth and rock. Someone remarked that even with Earth-type law, clearing it would take more time and energy than they could afford. Krysa volunteered to walk ahead and check whether the blockage continued further down. He disappeared around the bend while the group waited. Two of the companions exchanged words about finding an alternative route. Going back was not an option. They had commitments to keep, and the mission to earn money for Kazami's plans could not wait. One of them mentioned wanting to help His Holiness build the funds he needed, and the conversation drifted into playful banter about admiration and who had the right to call whom what. Kazami listened from the side, momentarily confused by the familial terms being tossed around. Chrysa returned with bad news. The path was blocked further ahead as well, and pushing through was not worth the risk. The group discussed their options and decided to detour toward a nearby settlement where they could stay the night and reassess in the morning. Kazami reflected briefly on how easily a road crew back in Japan could have cleared the obstruction and how different things were in a world without heavy machinery. They found a house deep in the forest at the edge of a small village. The place seemed deserted at first. No one came to greet them, and the paths between the buildings were empty. Chrysa offered to speak with the villagers, while Kazami and the others looked around. There was a barn nearby, and the smell of livestock hung in the air. Sounds from inside confirmed that people were there, even if they were not coming out. One of the group stayed back to guard the luggage and animals while the rest approached. A man finally emerged, and the reason for the village's reluctance became clear immediately. Their cattle were dying. A strange disease had been sweeping through the herd, leaving the animals weak and collapsing without warning. The villagers had been struggling to keep up with the care, and the crisis had consumed every resource they had. Hospitality was the last thing on their minds. Kazami listened to the description of the symptoms, and his mind went to work. Weakness, anemia, the animals going down suddenly. He recognized the pattern. He told the villagers it was pyroplasmosis, a tick-borne disease that attacked the red blood cells and caused severe anemia. It was similar to malaria in how it operated. The parasites entered the bloodstream through tick bites and multiplied until the animal's body could no longer keep up. Left untreated, it could kill, but treated properly, with rest, tick removal, and good nutrition, the cattle could recover. The villagers stared at him like he had spoken a foreign language, which, in a sense, he had. But the confidence in his voice was enough to make them listen. The veterinarian from another world had found his next patient. The village elder looked at Kazami with a mix of confusion and cautious hope. He told the group that if Kazami could truly help the cows, they were welcome to stay. Kazami introduced himself properly, explaining that he specialized in studying animal diseases and that his knowledge could make a real difference. He offered a simple trade. He would treat the livestock in exchange for a place to sleep and whatever support the village could spare. He also mentioned that they had heard about a harpy in the area and intended to deal with that problem as well. His companions stood behind him, silent and steady, signaling that this was not an empty promise. Kazami told the elder he would do everything he could. He got to work immediately. The anemic cows needed nutrient-rich leaves and grain to rebuild their strength, along with proper rest inside the barn where they could be monitored. He explained the tick removal process in detail, showing the villagers how the parasites latched onto the animal's skin and transferred the organisms that caused the disease. The condition was called pyroplasmosis, and it worked by destroying red blood cells until the animal was too weak to stand. With careful treatment, recovery would take 2 to 3 weeks. Khloe listened closely and asked about the disease. Kazami walked her through how the pathogen operated, how it broke down the blood cells and led to anemia and jaundice. She asked what their options were for stopping it at the source. He told her there were 2. They could take preventive measures, keeping the cattle away from infested pastures and managing the tick population through controlled grazing. Or they could burn the fields entirely and let fresh grass regrow clean. It was a harder choice, but a more permanent solution. The elder weighed both options and decided on burning. Housing the cattle in the barn full-time was too much of a burden for a village this small, and clearing the pastures would give them a real chance at stopping the cycle for good. Kazami agreed with the decision. The conversation shifted to the harpy. The group discussed what they knew. Harpies were half-human, half-bird creatures that used wind-based attacks and moved through the air with dangerous speed. The one terrorizing this village was likely a stray, separated from its flock and injured. The debate over what to do with it ranged from capture and release to someone's dry suggestion about turning it into a meal. Kazami made it clear that he preferred to act based on what he found when they encountered the creature, not on assumptions. Chrysa spoke up and made a point that settled the discussion. He told Kazami that his role was unique and irreplaceable. No one else in this world had the knowledge to do what he did. That meant he could not afford to take unnecessary risks, but it also meant the work he was doing mattered more than anyone else's. The implication was clear. More threats like this were coming, and Kazami needed to be ready for them. Kazami responded with the philosophy he had been building since Nora's death. Change did not come from the top down. It came from the ground, from small actions repeated until they became systems. He told the group that no one should be abandoned, not the cattle, not the villagers, not the people in the slums back in Hydra. Liz backed him without hesitation, telling the others that they should focus on doing what they could with what they had right now. There was no point in waiting for perfect conditions. The group settled into that resolve, and the work ahead felt less like a gamble and more like a beginning. Kazami walked through the basics with his companions before they headed into the field. He explained his techniques for examining animals without risking disease transmission and asked them to trust the process. The conversation touched on the need for caution. Invasive diseases could spread in ways no one expected, and if the situation became unmanageable, he was willing to pull back rather than push forward recklessly. One of the others raised the point that they should avoid killing anything unnecessarily. Kazami agreed. That had always been his preference. Khloe was eager to contribute. She told the group she wanted to help Kazami earn the funds he needed for his larger plans. Liz, predictably, showed less enthusiasm, but went along without complaint. The group decided to start by investigating the Harpy's territory and gathering whatever information the villagers could provide about its habits and location. Along the way, Khloe mentioned something that caught Kazami's attention. On a nearby hill, there was a rare medicinal herb she had heard about. She described it with growing excitement before realizing the implications of what she was saying, and her explanation trailed off into embarrassed silence. Kazami's curiosity was already hooked. The discussion turned to the mandrake. One of the group explained what it was, a plant that screamed when uprooted, with properties that ranged from medicinal to aphrodisiac. The explanation was animated and enthusiastic until the speaker noticed the awkward looks being exchanged around the group. The topic was quietly set aside, though Khloe's interest in acquiring some of the herb did not go unnoticed. Out in the field, Quina came bounding back with a rabbit dangling from her hands, her ears perked up with pride. She presented it to the group like a trophy and waited for praise. Kazami congratulated her, noting it was her second catch of the day. Quina beamed and looked toward Liz, hoping for a reaction. She asked for an ear knead as a reward, and the exchange between them carried the warmth of two people who had been through enough together to share that kind of familiarity. Kazami redirected the group's attention. He explained that the ticks they had been collecting from wild animals and plants needed to be examined carefully. Understanding which species carried the parasites and where they were concentrated was critical for both the livestock and the people living here. The safety of the village depended on getting this right. They agreed to stop gathering samples for the day. Quina suggested using the rabbit for dinner, and someone confirmed there would be enough food to go around. The group moved toward the herb hill, and the mountain's dense vegetation surrounded them. Khloe took the lead on identifying plants, pointing out which ones had medicinal properties. She explained how certain herbs could slow blood circulation and stop bleeding, knowledge she had picked up from her training at the Hydra church. The others asked questions and traded light banter about the plants and their uses, the kind of easy conversation that filled the spaces between danger. By the time they set off toward the Harpy's territory to gather the last of their samples, the mood had settled into something comfortable. It was a day of exploration and learning, the kind of work Kazami had always believed in. Small steps, careful observation, and the steady accumulation of knowledge that would, in time, change everything. The climb up the herb hill was steeper than it looked. By the time the group reached the top, they were catching their breath and taking in the dense wall of vegetation that surrounded them. Someone commented on how quickly Kazami had picked up the local plant identification, impressed by how naturally he absorbed information from this world. Then, someone else noticed he was gone. Kazami had been right beside them moments ago, but the mountain's thick undergrowth had swallowed him without anyone realizing. Khloe asked where he went. Liz tried to use her senses to track him, but the wind and the heavy scent of the forest made it impossible to isolate his trail. The group speculated. Kazami had a tendency to wander when he was outdoors, his curiosity overriding any sense of caution. Someone joked that he turned into a wild animal the moment he set foot in nature, but they also noted that no monsters had attacked the group since they arrived, which meant the creatures in the area were not hostile toward Kazami either. Wherever he was probably fine. The group decided to press ahead toward the Harpy's nest as planned, and trust that Kazami would find his way to them. Someone mentioned the ether they had brought for capturing the Harpy, and the concern concern about Kazami having the supplies shifted the urgency slightly. Meanwhile, Kazami stood alone in a part of the forest he did not recognize. A small plant creature sat on his shoulder, babbling sounds that meant nothing. He asked it if it knew where they were, then sighed when he realized that was a pointless question. A noise caught his attention. Something was screaming nearby, a high-pitched, rhythmic sound that cut through the trees. He followed it and found the source, a mandrake, partially uprooted, its tiny body thrashing and its voice shrieking at a pitch that made his teeth ache. Kazami picked it up and studied it. The screaming continued without pause, the same sound over and over. He wondered aloud whether the thing could understand him. The mandrake responded with a single sharp word that sounded disturbingly close to human speech. Kazami flinched. He started moving immediately. A mandrake's scream was not just annoying. In the legends he remembered, it was lethal. Even if this one was immature and less dangerous, the noise would attract attention from things he did not want to meet. But the potential was too great to ignore. If the mandrake's properties were real, its medicinal value could be enormous. The possibility of creating an all-purpose remedy drove him forward, even as common sense told him to drop it and run. A flash of memory crossed his mind, Liz's voice warning him to stop. He pushed past it. The mandrake was too important. Then something hit him from behind. It was soft, heavy, and warm, wrapping around him before he could react. Kazami stumbled forward, confused and startled, unable to see what had grabbed him. Whatever it was clung to his back, with a grip that felt nothing like a monster's attack, and everything like something far more unsettling. Someone shouted at Kazami to get away from it. He heard the warning a second too late. The thing clinging to him was an Alron, a plant-based monster with a female form and vine tendrils that could strangle and digest anything they caught. One of his companions moved in fast, weapon ready, demanding to know why the creature was attached to him. Kazami scrambled free, shaken but unhurt, and confirmed he was fine. The group gathered around and assessed the situation. Someone explained what Alraunis were. They consumed everything: prey, nutrients, anything within reach. The standard approach was to kill them on sight. It was safer for everyone. Kazami listened, but the advice did not sit right with him. The Alron that had grabbed him was injured. One of its limbs had been severed, likely from the earlier fighting when Liz had kicked it clear across the clearing. It was not attacking, it was clinging. He wrestled with himself for a moment. The others watched him struggle with the decision, some confused, some impatient. Kazami told them plainly that as a veterinarian, living things mattered to him, even monsters, even something as dangerous as an Alron. The response was mixed. Liz looked at him with the flat expression she reserved for moments when she thought he was being foolish. Khloe seemed torn between supporting him and agreeing with the others. Kazami made his choice. He crouched down beside the injured Alron and got to work. Using his dissection knife and bandages, he reattached the severed parts with a basic grafting technique, treating the creature the same way he would treat any wounded animal. The work was delicate and strange, patching together something that was half plant and half monster, but the fundamentals of wound care were the same regardless of the patient. The Alroni did not resist. By the time he finished, it sat quietly, watching him with an expression that might have been gratitude or might have been nothing at all. Kazami stood up and said his farewell to the creature. It remained where it was, no longer hostile, no longer reaching for him. He turned back to the group and told them it was time to move on to what they had actually come here to do. The harpy was still out there. Someone expressed determination to finally deal with it, and the group's energy shifted from the strange detour with the Alron back to the mission. They gathered their equipment and headed toward the harpy's territory. Kazami confirmed they were ready. The nest was close, and whatever they found there, he intended to handle it the same way he handled everything else in this world, with knowledge, caution, and the belief that killing was not always the answer. The group fell into formation and pressed forward into the trees. They found the harpy's nest in a large tree at the edge of the hill. Kazami told the others to stay back. He would approach alone. If they all moved in at once, the harpy would panic, and a panicked half-bird with wind-based law magic was not something anyone wanted to deal with in a confined space. The group held their positions, and someone voiced concern about letting him go in without backup. Kazami waved it off and moved toward the hollow. Inside, the harpy was resting. It was curled up in the nest, motionless, its feathered limbs folded close. Kazami stopped and studied it. The creature was exactly what the legends described, half human, half bird, its body bare in a way that made him briefly uncomfortable. He shook the thought off and focused on what mattered. There was visible swelling around its ankle, a cream-colored lump that looked inflamed and painful. That was what he had been looking for. He reached out carefully and brushed his fingers against one of its wings to check the condition of the feathers. The contact was brief, barely a second, but it was enough. He pulled his hand back, his face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and clinical frustration at himself. This was a patient, not a person. He needed to focus. The harpy stirred, its eyes snapped open, and the cry it let out was sharp enough to make Kazami's ears ring. He stumbled backward as the creature surged upright, its wings spreading to fill the hollow. Kazami raised his empty hands and tried to speak to it, telling it he had no weapons and was only there to help. The harpy did not care. Its aggression built fast, its body tensing, its mouth opening for a second scream that carried the promise of a wind attack behind it. Kazami thought one word. This was bad. The harpy lunged. He threw himself to the side as it rushed past, its talons raking the air where he had been standing. The sound of movement brought Khloe sprinting in from the tree line. She called out to him, asking if he was all right. Kazami confirmed he was unhurt and told her the harpy was more frightened than hostile. Someone suggested they should just capture it by force, but Kazami knew that brute strength would only make things worse. Khloe launched her chain in an attempt to entangle the harpy's wings. The creature responded by flapping hard, throwing gusts of wind that pushed everyone back. The group regrouped and discussed their options. Kazami admitted that his approach had probably agitated the harpy more than it should have. His presence, unfamiliar and unexpected, had triggered the creature's defenses. They needed a different plan. Kazami told them he was going to set up traps instead of trying to corner the harpy directly. If they could stun it or slow it down without a direct confrontation, he could get close enough to examine the swollen ankle and treat whatever was causing the pain. The group agreed, though Liz warned him to be careful. She reminded him that not every creature responded to kindness, and Kazami's tendency to assume the best about living things was a gamble that could get him killed. Kazami heard her and accepted the risk. He had been a veterinarian long enough to know that the most dangerous patients were the ones in the most pain. That was exactly why they needed his help. Kazami went back to the all-round clearing and collected the cut vines he had seen earlier. He tied them together and tested their strength, noting that the effect they had on monsters might differ from what they did to humans. Someone asked whether the mandrake he had pulled earlier would be useful for the plan. Kazami considered it. The immature mandrakes he had encountered were loud enough to stun, but whether they could stop something as strong as a harpy was another question. The only way to find out was to try. He rigged the traps between the trees in the area leading toward the harpy's nest, tying the vines to immature mandrakes so that any movement through the path would yank them from the ground. The mandrakes babbled their repetitive sounds while he worked, their voices mimicking words like parrots without understanding any of them. When one was accidentally disturbed during setup, it let out a shriek that made everyone within earshot flinch and cover their ears. The noise was far louder than its size suggested. With the trap set, Kazami called out to Khloe. He told her to lure the harpy into the area between the trees. The dense canopy would restrict its flight, and the narrow spaces would force it to move on foot where the traps could catch it. Khloe moved into position, and the group coordinated around the plan. The harpy followed. Khloe drew it in, dodging its wind attacks while keeping it focused on her. The creature chased her through the trees, and the moment it crossed the trap line, the mandrakes were ripped from the earth. The scream that followed was devastating. A shockwave of sound erupted outward, flattening everything nearby and stunning the harpy mid-stride. Kazami covered his ears and pressed himself against a tree. The blast was intense enough to feel like a fantasy version of a grenade. Even the creatures in the surrounding forest went silent in the aftermath. When the noise died, the harpy was on the ground, dazed and immobile. Kazami moved in quickly. He confirmed the traps had worked and knelt beside the stunned creature. The medical potential of the mandrake was real, and the successful execution proved the concept. But right now, his attention was on the patient. He examined the harpy's legs and found what he had suspected from the beginning. The swelling around the ankle was severe, inflamed, and painful to the touch. It was gout. The uric acid crystals had built up in the joint, causing the kind of agony that would make any creature lash out at anything that came close. The harpy had not been attacking out of malice. It had been attacking because it was in constant, unbearable pain. Kazami told the group they needed to get the harpy back to the village as fast as possible. He would perform surgery to remove the crystals and relieve the pressure. The team moved to dismantle the remaining traps and organize the transport. Khloe assisted with securing the harpy's wings, and the others cleared the path. The work ahead was delicate, but for Kazami, this was exactly where he belonged. Not on a battlefield, not in a throne room, but beside a creature that needed a doctor more than it needed a hero. While the others dealt with the stunned harpy, Khloe stood apart, holding something she had picked up from the herb hill, a mandrake. She turned it over in her hands, her face flushed, and her thoughts racing to places she would never say out loud. She imagined preparing it for Kazami, serving it as a drink, watching the effects take hold. The fantasy played out behind her eyes for a few dangerous seconds before someone called her name and snapped her back to reality. She hid the mandrake behind her back, stammering that she was not holding anything, her embarrassment written across her entire body. The group reassembled, and someone noticed a problem. The noise from the mandrake traps had drawn attention from the surrounding area. A herd of mature mandrakes had gathered nearby, and their pollen was beginning to drift through the trees. Liz warned the others immediately. The pollen caused hallucinations, and inhaling too much of it could leave a person unable to tell fantasy from reality. Kazami appeared from the undergrowth a moment later, startling everyone. Someone compared his approach to a wild animal's, and Kazami offered an apologetic grin. He had set the traps, and the consequences of triggering them were partly his fault. The group retreated toward the village, carrying the sedated harpy between them. The pollen cloud was spreading, and staying in the area any longer was not worth the risk. Back in the village, Kazami set up his workspace and prepared for surgery. The harpy lay still under the effects of ether, its breathing slow and steady. He explained to Khloe what they were dealing with. The gout had caused uric acid crystals to build up inside the ankle joint. In birds, the condition worked differently than in humans. The crystals formed from protein metabolism rather than purine intake, and the treatment required cutting into the joint, removing the deposits, and allowing the tissue to heal. It was not a complicated procedure, but it demanded precision and a steady hand. Khloe assisted throughout, her healing law ready the moment Kazami finished the surgical work. He opened the joint, cleared the crystals, and closed the wound. Khloe's magic accelerated the healing, knitting the tissue back together far faster than nature would have allowed on its own. By the time they were done, the swelling had already begun to recede. Kazami stepped back and looked at the harpy. He told the group that once it recovered, they would release it back into the wild. It would return to its flock. Someone suggested harvesting a few feathers first, noting their value as enchantable equipment materials. Kazami refused. The harpy was a patient, not a resource. It had come to them in pain, and it would leave whole. As the evening settled over the village, Khloe approached Kazami with a cup in her hands. She told him she had prepared something special, a herbal drink for his health and energy. The liquid was dark, bitter smelling, and earthy in a way that did not inspire confidence. Kazami looked at it, looked at Khloe's expectant face, and drank it without asking questions. Whatever was in it, the taste was terrible. Khloe watched him swallow it with an intensity that suggested she knew exactly what she had put in it, even if Kazami did not. He set the cup down and looked out at the village. The cattle were recovering. The harpy was healing. The fields would be burned and regrown clean. None of it had been simple, and none of it had come without cost. But every problem he had faced since arriving in this world had been met the same way, with knowledge, with patience, and with the belief that saving a life, any life, was never wasted effort. Kazami Shingo had been summoned to this world as a veterinarian. He had not become a legendary warrior. He had not built a nation or ridden a dragon into battle. He had done something quieter and, in its own way, something far more difficult. He had looked at a world full of suffering and refused to accept it. One patient at a time, one disease at a time, one small village at a time. He was building the kind of change that no sword could ever achieve, and he was just getting started.